Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a period that often looks so prim and proper in our history books. The Victorian era. You picture grand houses, polite society, maybe a lovely carriage ride through Hyde Park. But let's be honest, that picture is probably missing a few aromas. Tonight, you're not just observing, you're there. You're standing on a cobblestone street in London, sometime in the mid-19th century, and the air hits you. It's a thick, heavy blanket of smells you can't quite categorize. A symphony of the truly unpleasant. The sweet, sickly stench of coal smoke, a gritty layer that coats your tongue and clings to your clothes, mixes with the acrid tang of horse manure. Trust me, there's a lot of horse manure, not just on the streets, but trampled into every crack and crevice, a constant, sticky reminder of animal life. Then there's the underlying, persistent reek of human waste, seeping up from overworked cesspits and overflowing drains, a smell that hints at unimaginable depths of squalor just beneath your feet. And mingling with all of it, a faint, almost metallic odor of something else. Decay, disease. It's an immersive experience, this London, and it's telling you, without a single word, that hygiene here is a concept still very much in its infancy. You're breathing it in, you're tasting it, and honestly, you probably won't survive this if you stayed here long without modern medicine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a narrow, bustling lane, jostled by passers-by. The cobblestones beneath your worn boots are slick, not from recent rain, but from an almost permanent film of muck. Carriages rumble past, splashing diluted filth onto your trousers. A grimy, soot-stained fog hangs low, clinging to the gas lamps that struggle to pierce the gloom. The buildings, once grand, are now uniformly dark, their brick facades blackened by decades of industrial exhaust. Every surface seems to weep grime. You reach out, almost instinctively, to touch a railing, and your fingers come away with a fine, greasy coating of soot and something you can't quite identify. It's a tangible, pervasive dirt that feels alive. Almost, this isn't the charming gaslit aesthetic of period dramas. This is the reality, raw and unvarnished. Your eyes sting, and a persistent cough begins to tickle your throat. It's easy for us, perched in our clean, sanitized future, to imagine a bygone era as merely different. We think of quaint customs, funny hats, and perhaps a general lack of germ theory. But the reality of Victorian hygiene, or the lack thereof, was an all-encompassing, visceral experience. It wasn't just about being a bit dusty. It was about living in a constant state of low-grade contamination, where every breath was a risk, every meal a gamble, and every step a potential encounter with something truly foul. You observe a woman meticulously sweeping her stoop, pushing the accumulated street detritus directly into the gutter, where it joins a sluggish river of effluent. It's a Sisyphean task, really, this battle against the grime, because the sources of filth are endless and systemic. Think about it. No widespread indoor plumbing, rudimentary waste disposal, and an exploding population crammed into ever-densifying urban centers. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was the very fabric of daily life. The air you're now breathing is thick with microscopic particles, Not just soot from the ubiquitous coal fires, but also dried animal waste, pulverized street garbage, and who knows what else. When you wipe your nose, your handkerchief comes away. Grey, you quickly learn to keep your mouth closed when a cart rumbles by, kicking up a cloud of everything. It's enough to make you long for a simple, clear breath of fresh air. A luxury that seems almost mythical in this environment. Mainstream historical fact: London's population nearly quadrupled during the 19th century, soaring from about 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by 1900. This explosive growth, coupled with slow infrastructure development, placed immense strain on existing sanitation systems, leading to extreme overcrowding and widespread public health crises. Imagine trying to manage the waste of a small city with the resources of a large village. It's an uphill battle, and you can practically feel the consequences in the air around you. Now for a quirky tidbit: wealthy Victorians would sometimes pay crossing sweepers to clear a path through the accumulated street filth so they could cross a busy road without sullying their expensive clothes. These unofficial, often child, laborers literally carved out temporary islands of relative cleanliness in the ocean of street grime. So, if you had a few pennies, you could buy yourself a moment of reprieve from the filth, a fleeting illusion of order in the chaos. It's a testament to how pervasive the dirt was that an entirely new microeconomy sprang up just to deal with it. You wonder if the sweepers themselves ever felt truly clean. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of coal for heating and industry was a greater contributor to respiratory illnesses than the bacterial and viral diseases spread by contaminated water and inadequate sewage. It's a chicken and egg situation of sorts. Was it the choking air or the poisoned water that was the primary villain in this unhygienic drama? As you cough again, the answer feels like both, definitely both. The very act of living here feels like a slow, gritty assault on your lungs and your immune system. You walk past a butcher shop, and the smell of raw meat, mingled with something faintly putrid, assaults your senses. The sawdust on the floor is dark with stains. A street vendor hawks oysters from a bucket, their shells caked with river mud. You hesitate, your modern sensibilities screaming a silent warning. The concept of refrigeration is still a distant dream, and food preservation is rudimentary at best. Every transaction feels like a gamble. You realize that clean in this era is a sliding scale, a relative term, and often a luxury. What we consider basic hygiene: washing your hands, having access to potable water, disposing of waste not universal expectations, but often privileges or outright impossibilities. For many, the noise adds to the sensory overload. The clang of blacksmiths, the cries of street vendors, the clip-clop of hooves, and the distant rumble of trains. It's a constant cacophony that drowns out polite conversation and amplifies the feeling of being overwhelmed. You notice the general pallor of the people around you, a sickly greyish hue that seems to speak of malnutrition and chronic illness. Even the children, usually so full of vibrant energy, seem subdued, their faces often smudged with soot, their eyes holding an ancient weariness. You see a small boy, no older than 7, sweeping a chimney, his face a mask of black, emerging from a soot-choked flue looking like a shadow. It's a stark reminder that childhood here is often short and brutal, and sanitation, or the lack of it, plays a significant role in that harsh reality. You become acutely aware of your own clothing. Your modern fabrics, designed for comfort and ease of washing, feel utterly out of place. Here, wool and heavy cotton are the norms, designed for warmth and durability, not necessarily cleanliness. You imagine trying to wash these heavy garments by hand in cold, possibly contaminated water, without the benefit of modern detergents. The thought alone is exhausting. It's not just the external dirt you contend with, but the insidious grime that would inevitably work its way into the fibers of your clothes, clinging to them, becoming a part of them. You start to feel itchy, a phantom sensation brought on by the sheer immersive dirtiness of it all. You wonder if anyone ever felt truly clean, truly fresh, or if it was just a constant battle to keep the worst of the filth at bay. The concept of a fresh start each day, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist here. You wake up and the grime from yesterday is still subtly present on your skin, in your hair, in the air of your room. It's a continuous accumulation, a slow build-up of the environment on your person. The water for washing, if you have it, would be cold and often collected from a communal pump, shared by countless others, its purity always in question. You realize that the very foundation of modern, hygiene-abundant clean water is a luxury beyond imagining for most. This constant battle against the invisible and very visible forces of dirt and disease would shape every aspect of life, from how people dressed to how they socialized, to how long they could expect to live. You take a deep, cautious breath, and the smell of Victorian London, a truly unique blend of human endeavor and environmental decay, fills your lungs once more. You're still standing amidst the sensory assault of Victorian London, that ever-present scent of coal, horse, and humanity clinging to your clothes like a second skin. It's a dry, raspy cough that finally breaks through your thoughts, a persistent tickle in your throat that makes you keenly aware of the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through the perpetual haze. And as you try to clear your throat, a truly alarming thought solidifies. Where do you even get a glass of clean water around here? You see a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10, pushing a handcart laden with wooden barrels. He's calling out, his voice thin and reedy, "Fresh water, penny a bucket." Your thirst, which you hadn't consciously acknowledged until now, suddenly feels immense. But then you look at the barrels. They're grimy, the wood stained dark, and the water inside looks murky. Is it actually fresh, or is it just fresh from the Thames, a river that you've quickly learned is less a waterway and more an open sewer? This is the fundamental dilemma of Victorian life. The most basic necessity, water, is often the most dangerous. The vast majority of Londoners, particularly the poor and working classes, relied on communal pumps, wells, or the very kind of water vendors you're now observing. Imagine queuing up, perhaps for hours, at a pump that draws its water from an underground source, hoping that source isn't contaminated by the overflowing cesspits just a few feet away. Or imagine buying water from a man whose barrels look like they haven't been cleaned since the last ice age, knowing that the water inside has likely been scooped directly from the river. Even for those with a private well, the urban sprawl meant that ground seepage from neighboring privers was an ever-present threat. You might think your well is pure, but the ground beneath London is a patchwork quilt of contamination. It's a hydration lottery, and the odds are not in your favor. Mainstream historical fact: the River Thames, which supplied much of London's drinking water, was so polluted by the mid-19th century that it was famously described as the Great Stink in 1858. An event so severe that Parliament itself had to suspend sittings due to the overwhelming stench. Imagine a smell so potent it literally shuts down the government. It wasn't just an odor problem, it was a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. and indeed, already happening, a quirky tidbit, before the great stink finally forced action. One common solution for householders who had privy wells essentially, cesspits overflowing, was to dig a new one nearby, simply abandoning the old one. The idea was that the earth would absorb the waste. Of course, this only exacerbated the problem, creating a labyrinthine network of hidden, seeping contamination beneath the very streets you walk. It's like trying to fix a leaky bucket by adding more holes, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of tea drinking actually mitigated the impact of contaminated water by boiling it, or if the sheer volume of tainted water consumed in other ways, like in food preparation or directly from pumps, simply overwhelmed any benefit. You see a woman serving tea from a steaming kettle, and for a moment, you feel a flicker of hope. Boiling water does kill pathogens, right? But then you remember that the water before it was boiled might have been handled in unsanitary ways, or the cups themselves might be less than sparkling. It's a complex web of vulnerabilities. You watch as a young woman dips a bucket into the sluggish river, her face impassive. This is how many survive, by simply taking what's available. You instinctively recoil, your mind screaming about cholera and typhoid, and for good reason. Cholera, in particular, ravaged London multiple times throughout the century. Its grim progress directly linked to contaminated water supplies. You can almost hear the faint, chilling coughs and groans that would have echoed through these very streets during an epidemic. Each sip of water a roll of the dice. Consider how you'd even wash your clothes or yourself without running water. In your home, every drop had to be fetched, carried, and conserved. A full bath, as we know it, was an extravagant luxury, reserved for the very wealthy, and even then, not an everyday occurrence. For most, washing meant a quick wipe down with a damp cloth, perhaps with water that had already been used for other purposes. The idea of fresh, clean running water on demand, hot and cold, would be utterly fantastical to someone living here. You'd prize every single bucket, treating it with a reverence that seems absurd to your modern self. Even personal hygiene items, like soap, were different. Soap was often harsh, made with strong lye, and certainly not the fragrant, moisturizing bars you might use today. It was a utilitarian product, designed to strip away grease and grime, not to pamper your skin. And with the limited water supply, even soap became a less effective tool in the constant fight against dirt. Imagine trying to get truly clean when the water itself is suspect and soap is a skin-chafing chemical. You'd probably end up feeling more grimy than when you started. The scarcity and impurity of water impacted everything. Food preparation, for instance. How do you wash vegetables thoroughly if the washing water itself is tainted? How do you ensure your cooking pots are truly clean? The risk of cross-contamination was enormous and largely unrecognized. People simply didn't understand the microscopic dangers lurking in their water supply. They attributed illness to bad air or moral failings, not to the clear liquid they were drinking. You walk past a public lavatory, a relatively new innovation, but even it has a certain air of despair about it. The smell is powerful. These facilities, while an improvement over open defecation, still relied on the same strained water infrastructure, often flushing directly into the same overloaded rivers. It's a stopgap measure, a patch on a gaping wound, rather than a true solution. The sheer volume of human waste, combined with industrial effluent, dye runoff, and animal carcasses, turned the Thames into a putrid highway of filth. It's no wonder people constantly fell ill. You might be thinking, but didn't they know? And the answer is, not in the way we do. They saw the effects, the cholera outbreaks, the dysentery, the constant sickness, but the cause remained elusive. To many, the prevailing miasma theory, that disease was caused by bad smells and putrefaction, made a kind of intuitive sense in a world that smelled so universally awful. If everything smells bad, and everyone is sick, surely the smells are the sickness. It was a logical conclusion drawn from incomplete data. It would take groundbreaking work by figures like John Snow, mapping cholera outbreaks to specific water pumps, to begin to dismantle this flawed understanding. But for now, you're living in a time when the very liquid essential for life is also, ironically, often a harbinger of death. The weight of that knowledge settles on you, making every swallow feel a little heavier, a little riskier. The pervasive, murky reality of water in Victorian London is still settling over you, that heavy, damp sensation of inherent uncleanliness. You've seen the communal pumps and the dubious water vendors. Now, imagine taking off those soot-dusted clothes and stepping into a bath. If you could even find one. This brings us to the truly eye-opening truth about Victorian bathing habits. They were far, far removed from our daily, steamy rituals. You might envision elegant porcelain tubs, fragrant soaps, and fluffy towels. Erase that image. For the vast majority of Victorians, bathing was not a daily or even weekly event. It was, at best, an occasional necessity, often performed under less than ideal conditions. For the working classes and the poor, a full bath was a rare luxury. If you lived in a crowded tenement, space was at a premium. There was no dedicated bathroom, no running water, and certainly no hot water on demand. Your bath might consist of a small portable tin tub brought into the kitchen or bedroom, filled with water painstakingly heated on a stove, if you even had one, and then carefully poured from buckets. This wasn't a relaxing soak. It was a logistical challenge. Mainstream historical fact. While bathing became more fashionable among the middle and upper classes towards the end of the Victorian era, even then it was typically a weekly affair, not a daily one. Many larger homes would eventually incorporate a dedicated bathroom, but these were the exception rather than the rule for most of the century and for most of the population. The idea of daily full-body immersion was practically unheard of. A quirky tidbit: for those who could afford it, elaborate bathing machines were sometimes used at seaside resorts. These wheeled huts would be rolled into the sea, allowing bathers, particularly women, to enter the water discreetly, shielded from public view by the walls of the machine. It highlights the peculiar modesty and social norms surrounding public exposure, even when engaging in an activity as fundamental as swimming or bathing. You can almost hear the squeals of genteel delight mixed with the squelch of wet bathing. Suits inside those contraptions, historians still argue whether the slow adoption of personal bathing was primarily due to a lack of infrastructure, no running water, no bathrooms, prevailing medical beliefs that too much bathing was bad for you or opened pores to disease, or simply long-held social habits and a perception that cleanliness meant something different than full-body immersion. Was it practicality, paranoia, or tradition? You watch a woman discreetly wiping her face and hands with a damp cloth, a swift, almost furtive gesture, and you get the sense it's a bit of all three dots. So, if full baths were rare, what did Victorians do? A basin and you were a jug for water war common. You'd wash your hands, face, and perhaps your neck and arms. The water, as you've learned, was precious and often not perfectly clean to begin with. This sponge bath or basin wash was the daily routine for most. You'd likely use the same water for multiple body parts, perhaps even sharing the basin among family members. The idea of fresh running water for each individual wash was simply unthinkable. Think about the implications for body odor. Without daily washing and with heavy, layered clothing, which we'll get to, the scent of society was quite different. People became accustomed to a certain baseline of human odor. Perfumes, often heavy and cloying, were used more to mask existing smells than to complement true cleanliness. You might catch a whiff of lavender or rose, but it's often fighting a losing battle against the more fundamental, organic sense of unwashed bodies and stale air. For the wealthy, things were a bit more advanced, but still not by our standards. They might have plumbed-in baths, but even these required a servant to haul up hot water from the kitchen range. The effort involved meant it wasn't a casual affair. Imagine a whole domestic operation just for your bath. The servants would be bustling, the kitchen fires stoked, the water heated and carried, bucket by heavy bucket, to the tub. It wasn't a quick 10-minute shower, it was a production, and the water, once used, still had to be manually emptied, often into the garden or down a drain, contributing to the very street filth you're trying to avoid. You might see advertisements for public baths or Turkish baths appearing in newspapers. These were often more communal affairs, sometimes for cleanliness, but also for leisure and perceived health benefits. A Turkish bath involved a series of heated rooms, sweating, scrubbing, and cold plunges. While offering a deeper clean, these were not an everyday option for the average person and often catered to specific demographics or those seeking a cure for ailments. It's like today's spa visit, a treat rather than a basic necessity. The concept of cleanliness itself was more about the appearance of one's clothes and surroundings than the actual condition of one's skin. You could look respectable even if you hadn't had a proper wash in weeks. It was about presenting a clean face to the world, literally and figuratively. Your outer garments, especially for men, would be brushed and aired, hats would be dusted, and shoes polished. But beneath the surface, a different story unfolded. The very idea of germs and bacteria, as we understand them, was still nascent. While Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch would make groundbreaking discoveries later in the century. For much of the Victorian era, the invisible world of microbes was unknown. People might intuitively understand that filth led to sickness, but the why was a mystery. This lack of scientific understanding directly impacted bathing habits. Why bother with a rigorous scrub if you didn't know what you were scrubbing away? A superficial cleaning seemed sufficient. You can't help but notice the sheer lack of plumbing everywhere you look. No pipes leading into homes, no drains for waste. Every drop of water, every ounce of waste, has a physical journey. This logistical hurdle alone explains so much about bathing habits. It's not a lack of desire to be clean, perhaps, but a colossal practical barrier. Imagine lugging water up several flights of stairs to a cramped attic room, performing a quick splash and dash, and then having to lug the dirty water back down again. It's enough to make you reconsider your commitment to a daily shower. And then there's the issue of soap. We touched on it briefly, but it bears repeating. Victorian soap was a far cry from the gentle, skin-kind formulas of today. It was often coarse, made with animal fats and lye, and could be quite harsh on the skin. It wasn't about delightful scents or moisturizing properties. It was about sheer cleaning power. Using such soap daily would likely irritate the skin, especially with limited rinsing water. Perhaps, then, less frequent bathing was also a form of self-preservation, protecting one's skin from the very cleaning agents meant to improve it. It's a bit of a grim joke, isn't it? The solution to one problem creates another dot. So as you watch the Victorians go about their day, you realize that their relationship with water and cleanliness is fundamentally different from yours. It's a constant negotiation with scarcity, labor, and a pervasive lack of understanding about invisible threats. The idea of a refreshing, cleansing bath after a long day is a distant, futuristic dream for them. For you, it's a modern comfort you now appreciate profoundly. You can almost feel the phantom itch of unwashed skin and the vague discomfort of clothes that haven't been truly clean in a while. The thought makes you sigh, a quiet, almost imperceptible exhalation that is immediately swallowed by the clamor and scent of the street. Having grappled with the scarcity of clean water and the rarity of a proper bath, you can't help but turn your attention to what Victorians did wear, and how those sartorial choices interacted with the prevailing conditions of filth. You're observing the endless parade of people on the street, and a mainstream historical fact immediately jumps out at you. Victorian clothing, especially for women, was incredibly voluminous and multi-layered. Think crinolines, petticoats, bustles, and heavy fabrics like wool and velvet. For men, it was often wool suits, starched collars, and top hats. All of this meant more fabric to collect dust, absorb sweat, and harbor unseen grime. You imagine trying to navigate a bustling, muddy street in a full skirt that sweeps the ground, collecting every speck of dust, every splash of mud, every stray bit of horse droppings. It's a constant battle. The hems of dresses, particularly for women of all social classes who spent time outdoors, would quickly become saturated with street filth. And unlike today, where you toss a dirty dress in a washing machine, cleaning these elaborate garments was a monumental task. The sheer volume of fabric meant hand washing was a Herculean effort, requiring large tubs, copious amounts of water, that precious, often dirty water, and a significant amount of physical labor. Drying these heavy clothes without modern dryers, especially in a perpetually damp and foggy climate, was another challenge entirely. You can almost feel the damp, slightly sour smell of perpetually undried laundry hanging in the air. A quirky tidbit to protect their elaborate dresses from the filthy streets. Women sometimes wore dress lifters or skirt suspenders, small clips or hooks that would pull up the hem of their skirts when walking outdoors. Imagine the delicate dance of trying to lift yards of fabric while navigating slippery cobblestones and avoiding rogue splashes. It's a small detail that speaks volumes about the everyday struggle against the omnipresent dirt. You can almost hear the rustle of the fabric as they try to keep their finery pristine. A futile attempt in the grand scheme of things. Historians still argue whether the restrictive and layered nature of Victorian clothing, particularly corset and multiple petticoats, contributed to poor skin health and hygiene by trapping sweat and hindering air circulation, or if people adapted through other means, such as frequent airing of undergarments. You see a woman adjusting her bonnet, a wisp of hair escaping, and you can't help but wonder about the hidden layers beneath her respectable outer shell. Was it truly as stifling and unhygienic as it seems to our modern eyes? Underneath those heavy outer layers, people wore undergarments. For women, this typically included chemises, drawers, and several petticoats. These were usually made of cotton or linen, fabrics that were easier to wash and more breathable against the skin. These undergarments were the primary line of defense. against body oils and sweat, reaching the more expensive and difficult to clean outer clothing. But easier to wash is a relative term. They still required manual washing, often with harsh soaps and limited water. You picture endless laundry. Days, the air filled with steam and the scent of lye, hands red and raw from scrubbing. For men, starched collars and cuffs were common. These could be detached from shirts and laundered separately, allowing the wearer to appear clean around the neck and wrists, even if the shirt underneath hadn't seen a thorough wash in a while. It was a clever workaround, a visual trick to maintain an appearance of respectability. You might see a gentleman with an impeccably white collar, but beneath his waistcoat, his shirt could tell a very different, far grungier story. It's all about presentation, isn't it? The illusion of cleanliness. The general practice was to air clothes frequently rather than wash them. Outer garments would be hung outdoors or near a window to freshen them. This helped dissipate some odors and allowed dust to be beaten out, but it certainly didn't remove deep-seated grime or microscopic pathogens. You can almost smell the stale air and accumulated dust that would cling to fabrics, slowly becoming a permanent part of the garment's aura. Imagine trying to air out a heavy wool overcoat in a perpetually smoky, dusty city. It's like trying to clean a sponge in muddy water. Consider shoes. Leather boots were the norm, sturdy but difficult to clean thoroughly. Walking through the perpetually muddy and manure-strewn streets meant shoes were constantly collecting filth. Polishing them helped, but the soles and crevices would inevitably harbor layers of dried dirt. You glance down at your own boots, now caked with London's characteristic blackish-brown residue, and you feel an almost primal urge to scrape them clean. An urge that you quickly realize is futile here. Every step is an act of accumulating more grime. The social implications of clothing and cleanliness were significant. Your attire was a powerful indicator of your social standing. A person with clean, well-maintained clothing, even if simple, projected an image of respectability and diligence. Conversely, dirty, ragged clothes immediately marked one as poor, careless, or perhaps even morally suspect. The pressure to maintain outward appearances, despite the monumental challenges, was immense. It was a silent judgment passed on every street corner. Even for the wealthy, laundry was a major operation, usually handled by a team of servants. Linens, sheets, and undergarments were boiled, scrubbed, and then often bleached in the sun. This was perhaps the closest approximation to modern deep cleaning. But it was labor-intensive and reserved for items that came into direct contact with the skin or were used daily. The sheer volume of household laundry, from table linens to bedsheets, meant that the laundry room was a perpetually busy and steamy hub of activity. It's enough to make you tired just thinking about it. The very concept of a change of clothes was different. You didn't have a vast wardrobe of easily washable items. Clothes were investments, often repaired and mended until they fell apart. You might have a few sets of undergarments, but outer garments were worn repeatedly for days, even weeks, between any form of deep cleaning. This reliance on airing, brushing, and spot cleaning meant that a certain level of ingrained dirt was simply an accepted part of life. The fibers of the fabric themselves became a repository for the era's pervasive filth. And what about children? Children's clothing, especially for the working class, was often patched, worn, and constantly dirty. Playing in the streets meant rolling in the same filth that adults walked through. The idea of pristine, easily washable children's clothes is a thoroughly modern concept. Victorian children were, by necessity, often grimy, their faces smudged, their clothes stained. It's hard to imagine the constant struggle of mothers trying to keep their little ones even remotely clean in such an environment. Armed with only a basin and a piece of harsh soap, you see a small group of children playing in an alley, their laughter echoing, and you notice the dark rings around their necks and wrists, a testament to the stubbornness of Victorian grime. The fashion for dark colors, especially black, for outer garments was perhaps a practical choice in a perpetually smoky and dusty city. Dark colors simply showed dirt less. It was a visual camouflage, allowing people to maintain an appearance of neatness even when their clothes were far from truly clean. It's a subtle concession to the overwhelming environment, a silent acknowledgement that complete was an impossible dream. You look down at your own now quite dirty modern clothes and realize how much you take for granted, the ease with which you can simply wash away the day's grime. Here, that grime is a part of the landscape and a part of you. You're still acutely aware of the clothing choices, the layers designed more for durability and appearance than actual hygiene, and the struggle to keep them even remotely presentable. In this grimy metropolis, this brings us inevitably to the most immediate and undeniable aspect of Victorian hygiene, or lack thereof: the smell. The previous section hinted at it, but now we're diving headfirst into the scent of society. And trust me, it's an immersive experience. You know that specific, slightly stale, vaguely sour smell that permeates an old building, especially one that hasn't seen much airing out. Magnify that by about 1,000, then add in the distinct aromas of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, animal waste, industrial pollutants, and the slow, inevitable decay of organic matter. That, my friend, is the underlying atmospheric fragrance of Victorian London. Personal body odor, as we understand it, was simply a much more accepted, pervasive element of daily life. Mainstream historical fact: deodorants as we know them, antiperspirants that block sweat glands, didn't exist in the Victorian era. People relied on less effective methods to mask or reduce odor, contributing to a generally more aromatic environment than we are accustomed to today. The idea of stopping sweat was an alien concept. The focus was on dealing with the smell. Quirky tidbit: while perfumes were used, particularly by the wealthy, a more common odor management strategy for many was the liberal application of strongly scented flower waters or sachets of dried herbs tucked into clothing. Imagine a slight aroma of lavender or rose struggling bravely against the more dominant notes of human biology and urban decay. It's a bit like putting a tiny air freshener in a dumpster. It's a valiant effort, but ultimately the dumpster wins. You might catch a fleeting, pleasant whiff, only for it to be immediately overwhelmed by the surrounding reality. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely perceived and were bothered by body odor as much as we are today, or if their constant exposure led to a desensitization, making it a less remarkable aspect of their daily sensory experience. Was it a constant assault on their noses, or did they simply filter it out as background noise? As you take another cautious breath, trying to mentally catalogue the layers of scent, you lean towards the idea that it must have simply been normal. So, how did they manage their personal odors, if not through rigorous daily washing? As you learned, full baths were rare. Sponge baths, focused on visible areas like hands, face, and neck, were the norm. This meant that less accessible areas of the body, where sweat glands are plentiful, often remained unwashed for extended periods. The heavy, layered clothing especially wool, trapped sweat and body heat, creating a perfect environment for bacteria to thrive and produce odors. You can almost feel the stifling weight of a wool suit or a layered dress, imagining the warmth and dampness building up beneath. For undergarments, as mentioned, these were changed more frequently than outer clothing. But frequently might still mean every few days, not every day. These basic layers absorb the bulk of the sweat and oils, protecting the more expensive outer garments. However, if those undergarments weren't properly washed and dried, they could quickly become a source of their own distinct aroma. You can almost imagine the faint, lingering scent of unwashed cotton, a subtle counterpoint to the stronger external smells. Perfumes and colognes were definitely used, but their purpose was often to mask rather than eliminate odor. They were stronger, bolder scents than many modern perfumes, designed to cut through the prevailing atmospheric miasma. A fashionable lady might dab on a heavy floral perfume, or a gentleman might use a musky cologne, but these were temporary solutions. You might pass someone and momentarily get a wave of artificial fragrance, quickly followed by the return of the underlying, more organic scent. It's like a fleeting, fragrant illusion. Beyond individual efforts, the very air of Victorian cities was so saturated with smells that it perhaps dulled the senses. The coal smoke, the industrial fumes, the horse manure, the uncollected garbage, the overflowing sewers, the animal slaughterhouses, these created a powerful, composite smell that probably made it difficult to isolate individual body odors. It was a cacophony of smells, and your personal scent was just one instrument in that pungent orchestra. You take another shallow breath, wondering if your own senses would eventually adapt, if you'd even notice the sheer assault of it all after a while. Another factor was diet. Without widespread refrigeration, food was less varied and often less fresh than today. Dietary habits, including a reliance on heavily spiced foods or foods that might cause digestive upset, could also contribute to overall body odor. What you eat has a direct impact on how you smell, and Victorian diets, especially among the working classes, were often monotonous and lacking in fresh produce. Social norms also played a role. In a world where everyone had a baseline level of body odor, it was simply less remarkable. It wasn't considered a personal failing in the same way it might be today, while extreme neglect would certainly be noticed. A general musk was part of the human condition. It wasn't polite to comment on it directly. You might discreetly turn your head slightly, or hold a handkerchief to your nose if the situation was particularly egregious, but open declarations of "Wow, you stink," were simply not done. It's fascinating how our perceptions of what is clean or acceptable in terms of personal scent are so culturally and historically conditioned. For those involved in manual labor, the situation was even more pronounced. Factory workers, coal miners, and agricultural laborers would have been constantly exposed to dirt, sweat, and grime. Their clothing would have been perpetually soiled, and their bodies perpetually dirty. The concept of showering off after a shift was, of course, non-existent. They carried the odors of their work, literally, on their bodies and clothes. You see a group of laborers trudging home, their faces grimed, their clothes stiff with dust and sweat, and you can almost taste the bitter, metallic tang of their day's exertions. The very air in homes, too, was often less than fresh, without modern ventilation systems and with a tendency to keep windows closed to conserve heat or keep out street noise and smells. Ironically, indoor air could quickly become stale, trapping the odors of cooking, bodies, and coal fires. It was a compounding effect where the external environment permeated the internal, and personal hygiene practices struggled to keep pace. You realize that a truly fresh scent was likely a rare and fleeting pleasure, perhaps only experienced on a crisp, clear morning in the countryside, far removed from the urban sprawl. So, while you might reach for your antiperspirant after reading this, the Victorians navigated a world where personal scent was a much more unavoidable and perhaps less judged reality. They lived in a constant, aromatic symphony of humanity and its environment. And as you try to block out the subtle but persistent smells surrounding you, you gain a new appreciation for the simple, odorless blessing of modern personal hygiene products. It's a quiet triumph, isn't it, to simply not smell? For them, that was a daily, often losing, battle. The swirling, layered scents of Victorian London are still lingering in your nostrils, a reminder of the era's unique aromatic profile. Now, let's shift our focus upwards to the very top of the Victorian person, their hair. You might imagine elaborate updos and perfectly coiffed styles, but beneath the surface of those intricate arrangements lay a persistent, incredibly common, and often maddening problem: head lice. This wasn't just a fringe issue for the very poor. It was a widespread, democratic pest. You see a young girl with long braided hair, and you can almost imagine the tiny, insidious creatures making their homes there. Maintaining hair cleanliness was an enormous challenge in an era with limited water, harsh soaps, and no understanding of modern hair care products. Washing hair thoroughly was a labor-intensive affair, often done infrequently, perhaps once a month, or even less, for many. Imagine trying to rinse thick, long hair with cold, hard water, without the benefit of conditioners or detergent. Would have been a tangled, difficult, and unpleasant experience. Mainstream historical fact: head lice were ubiquitous across all social classes in Victorian Britain, from the poorest slum dwellers to the wealthiest aristocracy. Evidence from preserved hair samples and contemporary accounts confirms their widespread presence, proving that even the most elaborate hairstyles couldn't protect against these tiny invaders. It was simply a fact of life, an almost unavoidable companion, a quirky tidbit. To combat lice, various home remedies were employed, some of which seem utterly bizarre to us today. One common concoction involved mercury ointment, a highly toxic substance applied to the scalp. Another, less dangerous, but probably equally ineffective, method was rinsing hair with diluted vinegar or paraffin. You can imagine the smell, not just of unwashed hair, but of these potent and sometimes dangerous cures permeating the air around someone. It's enough to make your scalp itch just thinking about it. Historians still argue whether the elaborate and heavy hairstyles, often incorporating hairpieces or extensions, exacerbated the problem of lice by providing more hiding places and making thorough cleaning even more difficult, or if these styles were, in part, a response to the practical difficulties of hair hygiene. Did the hairstyles encourage the lice, or were they a strategic attempt to manage the appearance of hair that was inherently hard to clean? As you watch a woman meticulously pinning up her voluminous hair, you wonder about the secrets hidden within its folds. So, if washing was infrequent, how did Victorians manage their hair? Brushing was key. Hairbrushes, often with stiff bristles, were used vigorously to remove dirt, dust, and loose hair. This also helped to distribute natural oils, giving the hair a sheen which was considered desirable. But brushing alone couldn't eliminate lice or their nits' eggs. Fine-toothed combs, often made of bone or ivory, were also employed, specifically designed to try and comb out lice and nits. This was a tedious, painstaking process, often performed by mothers on their children, or by maids on their mistresses. The sheer length of hair, especially for women, added to the challenge. Long hair, while beautiful, is a magnet for dirt and tangles. Imagine the sheer volume of hair that needed to be managed, detangled, and kept somewhat presentable. For those with really long hair, the process of washing, drying, and styling would have taken hours, making it an undertaking not to be rushed or performed frequently. For men, hair was generally shorter and therefore somewhat easier to manage. Daily brushing and styling with pomades or hair oils were common. Beards and mustaches also became fashionable in the latter half of the century, and these, too, required their own maintenance, from special waxes to combs. While perhaps less prone to widespread lice infestations than long, unwashed hair, they still presented their own hygiene challenges in a dirty environment. The social stigma associated with lice, while present, was perhaps less intense than it is today, simply because it was so common. It wasn't necessarily seen as a sign of extreme poverty or neglect, though it certainly wasn't desirable. It was more of an annoying, persistent reality that many families simply had to deal with. The remedies, both folk and medical, focused on killing the pests rather than preventing them through rigorous daily washing. Because the infrastructure for that daily washing simply didn't exist for most. Consider the shared environments, crowded living spaces, schools, workplaces, and public transport. These were ideal breeding grounds for lice. A single infested individual could easily spread the pests to dozens of others in close proximity. It was a constant cycle of reinfestation, making total eradication a near impossible dream for most families. You might be meticulously clean, but if your neighbor, your fellow factory worker, or the child sitting next to you on the omnibus has lice, you're at risk. Another aspect of hair care involved hats. Both men and women wore hats, ostensibly outdoors, offering some protection from the elements and the ubiquitous dust. However, hats could also trap heat and moisture, creating a warm, damp environment that lice would find quite appealing. Look at the array of elaborate hats passing by, from bonnets to top hats, and realize that each one might be harboring its own secret, unseen ecosystem. The lack of effective, readily available lice treatments meant that infestations could be long-lasting and uncomfortable. The constant itching, the visible nits clinging to hair shafts, and the general discomfort would have been a daily nuisance. For children, it could disrupt sleep and concentration, and for adults, it was a source of persistent irritation. It's hard to truly relax and focus when you're constantly battling an itchy scalp. The very idea of a healthy scalp was likely different. Flaking, itching, and dryness were probably common. Modern shampoos, with their specific formulations for different hair types and scalp conditions, are a marvel by comparison. The harsh soaps of the era would likely strip the scalp of its natural oils, leading to more irritation and potentially making it more vulnerable. It was a vicious cycle. Try to clean your hair, dry out your scalp, get more irritation, making it less likely you'd want to wash it frequently. You also think about the hair salons or barber shops of the era. While they existed, they operated under very different hygiene standards. Combs and brushes might not be sterilized between clients. Shared tools could easily spread not only lice, but also skin conditions. A trip to the barber might clean up your beard, but it could also introduce a new unwanted guest to your scalp. The thought makes you shiver slightly. a phantom itch suddenly blossoming on your own head. So, as you observe the carefully arranged curls and stately coiffures, remember the unseen battles waged beneath. The elegant facades of Victorian society often concealed a persistent, itchy reality. Head lice were a democratic nuisance, unaffected by social status, and a constant testament to the era's ongoing struggle with even the most basic aspects of personal hygiene. You find yourself subtly, almost unconsciously, reaching up to scratch your own scalp. Just in case, your scalp is probably still feeling a phantom itch from our last discussion about Victorian hair and its persistent tiny inhabitants. Now, let's move south a bit and dive into a truly painful aspect of Victorian hygiene: oral health. Prepare yourself, because this is where things get genuinely grim. And you'll find yourself immensely grateful for modern dentistry. You're observing the faces around you, and a striking observation emerges. Many adults, even relatively young ones, have missing teeth, or teeth that are discolored, decayed, and visibly painful. The smiles you see are often hesitant or quickly hidden. This is the stark reality of Victorian oral hygiene, a period largely devoid of preventative care, effective treatments, and even a basic understanding of what causes cavities. Mainstream historical fact: sugar consumption increased dramatically during the Victorian era due to its growing affordability, but this rise in sugar intake was not matched by advances in dental hygiene or care, leading to widespread tooth decay and rampant dental problems across all social classes. Imagine a nation suddenly able to afford more sweets than ever before, but with no toothbrushes or toothpaste as we know them. It's a recipe for disaster, a quirky tidbit for those who could afford them. False teeth were sometimes made from the teeth of deceased soldiers or even executed criminals, often purchased from battlefield scavengers or body snatchers. These macabre Waterloo teeth, as they were sometimes called, were a stark reminder of the lengths people went to for a full set of choppers, even if the origin story was unsettling. It's a truly chilling thought, isn't it, to think that your new smile might have come from a recent battlefield casualty. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of lead and mercury in various Victorian medical treatments, some of which were even aimed at oral issues, inadvertently worsened dental health or created other systemic health problems that overshadowed the direct impact of poor hygiene. Was the cure sometimes worse than the disease when it came to oral care? As you wince at the thought of such remedies, the answer feels intuitively like yes. So, what was the daily oral routine for most Victorians? For the vast majority, it was incredibly rudimentary, if it existed at all. Toothbrushes, as we recognize them, were rare and expensive. If used, they were often made from animal bone and boar bristles, which could be harsh on gums. Toothpaste didn't exist in tubes. Rather, people might use tooth powders, often made from abrasive substances like charcoal, salt, or even crushed brick dust. Imagine scraping your teeth with finely ground brick. It sounds like a fast track to enamel erosion. More commonly, people simply rubbed their teeth with a cloth or a finger, perhaps using a bit of soot or salt. The goal was more about polishing away visible stains than actively preventing decay or gum disease. The concept of bacterial plaque and its role in cavities was, of course, unknown. They dealt with the symptoms, not the cause. The consequences were dire. Toothache was a pervasive, excruciating reality for millions. Without modern pain relief, the agony of a decaying tooth would have been unbearable. The most common solution for a persistent toothache was extraction. Tooth drawers or barbers, rather than trained dentists, often performed these extractions using crude, often unsterilized instruments like pelicans or keys that simply wrenched the tooth from the jaw. You can almost hear the screams that would have echoed from these impromptu dental procedures. And without anesthetics, ether and chloroform only became widely available for surgery later in the century. It was a brutally painful experience. Infection was a massive problem. An abscessed tooth, untreated, could lead to widespread infection, sometimes even death. A common cause of death in the Victorian era, though often listed under more general terms like fever, could stem from untreated dental infections spreading to the bloodstream. Your mouth, a gateway to the rest of your body, could become a deadly portal. Even for the wealthy, dental care was far from glamorous. While they might have access to more skilled surgeon dentists, the treatments were still limited. Fillings might be done with tin, silver amalgam which contained mercury or gold. But the techniques were crude by modern standards, and the fillings often failed. Root canals were largely unheard of. The goal was often to save the tooth for as long as possible, even if it was chronically painful. Consider the appearance. A beautiful, gleaming white smile was a rarity. Teeth were often stained from tobacco, smoking and chewing were widespread, tea and coffee. Decay was visible, and missing teeth was simply a fact of life. Imagine trying to conduct polite conversation or maintain a romantic gaze when half your teeth are gone or black with decay. It undoubtedly impacted social interaction and self-confidence. The pervasive poor diet, particularly among the working classes, exacerbated dental problems. Diets high in starchy breads, cheap sweets, and often lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables contributed to rampant decay. Children, in particular, suffered terribly from early tooth loss. You might see a child no older than 10 with several missing teeth, a grim testament to their diet and lack of care. The absence of fluoride, a commonplace ingredient in modern water and toothpaste that strengthens enamel, also played a significant role. Without this protective agent, teeth were more vulnerable to the corrosive effects of acids produced by bacteria. It's like fighting a battle without your best armor. Furthermore, gum disease, periodontal disease, was likely rampant. Without regular, thorough cleaning, plaque and tartar would build up, leading to inflamed, bleeding gums, bad breath, and eventually tooth loss. The chronic inflammation in the mouth would have had systemic effects on overall health, contributing to a general state of ill health. And let's not forget the sheer sensory aspect, the constant bad breath, without proper brushing, flossing which didn't exist. And with rampant decay and gum disease, halitosis would have been widespread. Imagine conducting a close conversation with someone whose mouth smelled of decay and stale food. It adds another layer to the overwhelming sensory experience of Victorian life. So, as you observe the hesitant smiles and the often grimaces of the Victorians, you feel a profound wave of gratitude for your toothbrush, your fluoridated toothpaste, and your friendly, or not so friendly modern dentist. The constant pain, the infection, the inevitable loss of teeth, these were not just inconveniences, but fundamental challenges to eating, speaking, and simply existing comfortably in the Victorian world. Your own teeth, for all their minor imperfections, suddenly feel like a gleaming triumph of modern hygiene. You've felt the phantom ache of Victorian dental woes, and the pervasive discomfort of unwashed bodies and grime-laden clothing. Now, let's widen our gaze from individual struggles to the larger societal battleground. Public health, In a world grappling with rudimentary hygiene and an exploding population, epidemics weren't just unfortunate occurrences, they were terrifying. Regular events that swept through communities with devastating speed. You're walking through a crowded district, perhaps by the river, and there's a new kind of chill in the air, a whisper of fear that isn't just about the grime. You might see crudely scrawled chalk marks on doors indicating a house under quarantine, or hear hushed conversations about the latest fever sweeping through a street. This is the era of devastating outbreaks: cholera, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis. These diseases preyed on the unsanitary conditions, exploding with merciless efficiency. Mainstream historical fact: London experienced several major cholera epidemics throughout the 19th century, particularly severe ones in 1832, 1848 to 49, and 1854. These outbreaks killed tens of thousands, highlighting the catastrophic failure of existing sanitation and water supply systems. Imagine living with the constant threat of a silent, invisible killer that could strike anyone, anywhere. A quirky tidbit: during severe epidemics, some people would carry posies of flowers or strongly scented herbs, believing that the pleasant smells would ward off the bad air or miasma thought to cause disease. You might see a well-dressed lady holding a small bouquet to her nose, a fragrant but utterly ineffective shield against the microscopic invaders. It's a poignant image, isn't it? This beautiful, fragile barrier against an invisible horror. Historians still argue whether the medical community's slow abandonment of the miasma theory in favor of germ theory prolonged the public health crises of the Victorian era, or if the sheer scale of the environmental problems simply made effective intervention difficult regardless of the scientific understanding at the time. Was it a failure of intellect or infrastructure, or both? As you observe the desperation in people's eyes, you suspect it was a complex interplay. The public health efforts of the time were often reactive, and based on flawed scientific understanding. The dominant miasma theory held that diseases like cholera and typhus were caused by bad air emanating from decaying organic matter, sewage, and filth. This led to efforts focused on cleansing the air-draining stagnant pools, whitewashing buildings, and improving ventilation. While these measures sometimes had beneficial side effects, for example, draining stagnant water reduced mosquito breeding, they didn't directly address the true causes of waterborne and airborne diseases. You might see sanitary reformers at work, advocating for cleaner streets and better ventilation. Their intentions were good, but their methods were often misdirected. They focused on visible dirt and bad smells, not the invisible bacteria and viruses that were the real culprits. Imagine an army fighting a war against the wrong enemy, while the true adversary silently infiltrates their ranks. The response to an epidemic was often chaotic. Hospitals were overcrowded and themselves often hotbeds of infection. Doctors, lacking knowledge of sterilization and germ theory, could inadvertently spread disease from patient to patient. Surgical instruments, bandages, and even doctors' hands were rarely cleaned between procedures or examinations. You might shudder at the thought of a doctor moving from a smallpox patient to a routine examination without even washing their hands. Quarantine was a common, though often ineffective, measure. Houses where disease had struck might be marked, and residents confined, but in crowded tenements. Disease could easily jump from room to room, floor to floor, or even through shared water sources. You might walk past a building that feels like a prison, knowing the misery and fear trapped within. The lack of proper sewage systems was, as you already know, a massive contributor to public health crises. Human waste flowing into rivers or accumulating in cesspits directly contaminated drinking water sources. It was a vicious cycle. People drank contaminated water, became ill, produced more contaminated waste, which then re-entered the water supply. It's a tragic testament to the destructive power of ignorance and inadequate infrastructure. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was another pervasive killer, particularly in the overcrowded, damp, and poorly ventilated housing of the working class. It was a slow, wasting disease that touched almost every family. You might hear the persistent, hacking coughs emanating from open windows, a grim soundtrack to the daily struggle for survival. And there was little to no effective treatment for it. The push for public health reform often came from individuals who, through observation and deduction, began to challenge the prevailing theories. John Snow's famous investigation of the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak, where he mapped cases and traced them back to a contaminated water pump, was a pivotal moment. It provided compelling evidence against the miasma theory and for the waterborne transmission of disease. You might imagine him tirelessly mapping, questioning, and gathering data, a lone voice of reason in a sea of misconception. However, even with Snow's groundbreaking work, acceptance of germ theory was slow. Old beliefs died hard. It took decades for the scientific community and the wider public to fully embrace the microscopic world of pathogens. Meanwhile, people continued to suffer and die from preventable diseases. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained ideas can be, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The role of government in public health was slowly evolving. The Public Health Act of 1848 was an early, though limited, attempt to establish a central authority for sanitation. Later, more comprehensive acts in the 1870s would lay the groundwork for modern public health administration, including regulations on housing, sewage, and water supply. These were hard-won battles, fought against vested interests, ignorance, and sheer inertia. You can almost feel the grinding slowness of bureaucratic change in the face of urgent human suffering. Children were particularly vulnerable. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, with many dying before their first birthday due to diseases like cholera, dysentery, and smallpox. The unsanitary conditions, poor nutrition, and lack of medical knowledge created a brutal environment for the youngest members of society. You see a mother cradling a sickly infant, her face etched with worry, and you understand the constant, gnawing fear that must have shadowed every parent. So, as you witness the struggles against disease in Victorian London, you gain a profound appreciation for our modern understanding of germs, our public health systems, and the everyday miracles of clean water and effective medicine. For the Victorians, life was a constant dance with death, often brought about by the very environment they inhabited. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the very ground you walk on, all could be silent carriers of disease, making survival an everyday victory. The spectre of epidemic disease, lurking in the very air and water, still hangs heavy over your perception of Victorian London. We've talked about the polluted Thames, the cesspits, the general lack of understanding about contagion. Now, it's time to delve into one of the most ambitious and ultimately transformative public health projects of the era: the creation of a comprehensive sewage system. A monumental undertaking that forever changed the face and the smell of the city. You're standing on a bridge overlooking the Thames, and the infamous Great Stink of 1858 is still a fresh, horrifying memory. The river, once a vital artery, had become an open sewer, its banks choked with effluent, its waters thick with human and industrial waste. The smell was so overwhelming, it literally drove politicians from Parliament. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was a constant, undeniable testament to the city's failing sanitation. It was this unbearable stench, rather than scientific understanding of germ theory, that finally galvanized action. The Victorians were driven by their noses, not their microscopes. To solve this particular problem, mainstream historical fact, Sir Joseph Buzard designed and oversaw the construction of London's vast underground sewer system between 1859 and 1875. This engineering marvel involved building 82 miles of main, intercepting sewers, and 1,100 miles of street sewers, diverting waste away from the Thames and significantly contributing to the eradication of cholera from the city. It was a project of truly epic scale, employing thousands of labourers and transforming the subterranean landscape of London. A quirky tidbit: before Buzard's system, night soil men or scavengers would manually empty cesspits from homes, often at night, to avoid the worst of the smell and public scrutiny. This unpleasant and dangerous job involved shoveling human waste into carts, which were then hauled away, often to be dumped in fields outside the city, or simply into the nearest body of water. Imagine that as your career choice, a truly thankless and hazardous occupation. Historians still argue whether the engineers and public officials responsible for the London sewer system fully grasped the germ theory of disease at the time of its construction, or if their focus on removing visible filth and bad smells was simply a fortunate alignment with what later proved to be the correct scientific approach. Was it brilliant foresight or serendipitous pragmatism? As you consider the scale of the undertaking, it feels like a heroic leap of faith, regardless of the underlying scientific clarity. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of waste seeping into the ground or flowing directly into the Thames at various points, massive intercepting sewers would collect it and carry it eastwards, far downstream from the city, to outfalls where it would be discharged into the river after it had passed the main populated areas. This wasn't treatment as we know it, but rather a massive system of diversion. It was like taking all the dirty laundry from 1,000 different baskets and putting it into one giant bag, then dragging that bag far, far away before opening it. You can almost feel the ground vibrate beneath you as you imagine the thousands of labourers, the navvies, toiling deep underground, digging enormous tunnels by hand, often in dangerous conditions, facing collapses, gas explosions, and the ever-present threat of disease from the very waste they were trying to control. It was an incredibly dangerous and physically demanding job. Many lost their lives building this subterranean triumph. The construction itself was a logistical nightmare. Huge quantities of brick and concrete were used. Pumping stations, like the iconic Crossness pumping station with its magnificent Victorian engines, were built to lift the sewage at various points, as gravity alone wasn't always enough to move the vast volumes of waste. These pumping stations were marvels of Victorian engineering, elaborate and ornate buildings housing powerful steam engines, a testament to the importance placed on this unseen infrastructure. When the system was finally completed, the impact was profound. The great stink disappeared. The cholera epidemics, which had ravaged London for decades, virtually vanished. The link wasn't immediately understood by everyone, but the correlation was undeniable. The streets, while still dusty and dirty from other sources, were no longer awash with raw sewage, and the air quality at least in terms of putrid smells, significantly improved. You can almost feel a metaphorical weight lifting from the city, a collective sigh of relief as the suffocating stench recedes. However, the new sewage system wasn't perfect. While it removed waste from central London, it simply dumped it, untreated, into the Thames further downstream. This created new environmental problems for the communities near the outfalls, impacting fisheries and polluting the estuary. It was a solution for London, but a new problem for the coastline. It highlighted the need for further innovation in waste treatment, which would come later. The widespread adoption of flush toilets, which had been around in rudimentary forms, was also spurred by the new sewer system. Before, a water closet that flushed would simply send its contents into a cesspit or overflow pipe, exacerbating the localized problem. With Basolgit sewers, the flush toilet became a viable and increasingly common fixture, first in wealthier homes, then gradually spreading through society. Imagine the sheer liberation of being able to flush away waste with a simple pull of a chain, knowing it was being carried far away. It was a quiet revolution in daily life. The cost of this immense project was staggering, requiring significant public funding and political will. It represented a major shift in thinking, from individual responsibility for waste disposal to a collective, municipal approach. It showed that large-scale public health improvements required large-scale public investment. It was a recognition that sanitation was not just a private matter, but a societal imperative. You realize that this massive invisible network beneath your feet is a defining legacy of the Victorian era. It's not as romantic as a steam train or a grand palace, but its impact on everyday health and quality of life was arguably far more significant. The very ground you stand on is honeycombed with these brick-lined tunnels, silently carrying away the waste of millions. A testament to a generation that literally dug itself out of its own filth. This infrastructure, while initially addressing the smell problem, inadvertently solved the disease problem. It's a powerful lesson in unintended positive consequences. The Victorians built better sewers to make their city smell nicer, and in doing so, they inadvertently conquered some of the deadliest diseases of their time. It's a bit of a cosmic joke, isn't it? The nose led the way for the saving of lives. As you look at the seemingly solid ground beneath your feet, you now know that a vast, hidden world of engineering marvels lies below. A testament to human ingenuity and perseverance in the face of overwhelming environmental challenges. The silence of the streets above now feels different. Knowing the unseen currents flowing beneath the monumental achievement of London's sewer system. A hidden triumph beneath your feet provides a stark contrast to the conditions on the surface. Conditions that you're still very much immersed in. We've touched on the grime, the smells, the public health crises, but now, let's talk about the very ground you walk on. The street life, and how it exemplified the constant, unyielding battle against filth. You're back on a bustling Victorian street, perhaps Fleet Street or Cheapside, and your boots are once again treading on a surface that is anything but clean. Forget pristine pavements. These are muddy, uneven, and perpetually soiled thoroughfares. The sheer volume of traffic, horse-drawn carriages, omnibuses, carts, and thousands of pedestrians constantly churns the ground, ensuring that any dry patch is quickly turned into a muddy, dusty, or manure-splattered mess. Every step is a negotiation with potential contaminants. Mainstream historical fact. Before the widespread paving and regular cleaning efforts improved, Victorian streets were routinely covered in vast quantities of horse manure. It's estimated that by the late 19th century, London's horses produced over 1,000 tons of manure daily, contributing significantly to the city's pervasive filth and odors. Imagine a city literally buried under its own animal waste. A quirky tidbit: street sweepers, often poor men or children, would use brooms and shovels to clear paths through the worst of the filth, sometimes piling the refuse into heaps in the middle of the street to be collected later. These piles, however, could sit for days, serving as temporary, odorous landmarks. You might step over a small, smoldering pile of detritus, a testament to someone's valiant but ultimately losing battle against the tide of urban waste. It's a job that requires a strong stomach and a stronger sense of purpose. Historians still argue whether the invention of macadamized roads, early forms of asphalt paving, significantly improved urban hygiene by reducing mud and dust, or if the sheer volume of traffic and lack of proper street cleaning methods simply shifted the problem from one form of filth to another. Did technology truly make a difference, or was it a mere palliative in the face of overwhelming dirt? As you feel the grit underfoot, you suspect the latter. The primary culprit for street filth was, as mentioned, horse manure. Horses were the engines of Victorian transport and commerce. Every carriage, every omnibus, every delivery cart was pulled by horses, each depositing its contribution to the street surface. This manure, mixed with straw, dust, and rain, created a truly disgusting sludge. When dry, it pulverized into a fine, irritating dust that stung your eyes and coated everything. When wet, it was a slippery, pungent mud that clung to boots and trouser hems. You instinctively lift your feet a little higher with each step, a subconscious effort to avoid the inevitable, beyond animal waste. The streets were also repositories for all manner of human refuse. Before comprehensive waste collection services, it was common for households to simply throw their rubbish food scraps, ashes, broken pottery, even human waste from chamber pots directly into the street or into overflowing communal middens. Waste heaps. You might see open drains carrying foul liquids from homes directly into the gutters, joining the river of muck. It was an out of sight, out of mind mentality, except it was very much in sight and in smell. The sounds of the street also contributed to the sense of pervasive dirt. The constant clip-clop of hooves, the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels grinding over cobblestones, the shouts of vendors and hawkers, all of it underscored the raw, unrefined nature of the urban environment. And amidst the noise, you might hear the faint, sickening splat of something being thrown from an upper window onto the street below. You learn quickly to stay alert, not just for pickpockets, but for airborne refuse. The dangers of such streets were manifold. Slipping on horse manure or wet refuse was a common hazard, leading to falls and injuries. The putrefying waste was a breeding ground for flies and rats, which in turn carried diseases. Children, who often played in these very streets, were particularly vulnerable to illness from direct contact with the filth. You see a group of children chasing a stray dog through a particularly muddy patch, and your modern sensibilities scream in alarm. Street lighting, though slowly improving with the advent of gas lamps, was still patchy. At night, the streets became even more treacherous, with hidden puddles of filth and discarded objects lurking in the shadows. Walking at night was not just a risk due to crime, but due to the unseen hazards of the physical environment. The sheer volume of human activity meant constant churning of the ground. Vendors selling everything from oysters to hot pies, peddlers hawking their wares, beggars, street performers, and the unending flow of commuters created a dense, bustling environment, where personal space was minimal and contact with the dirty environment was unavoidable. You're constantly jostled, pushed, and brushed against. Each encounter a silent exchange of invisible particles. Even simple tasks were complicated by the street conditions. Crossing the road could be an expedition, requiring careful navigation through traffic and deep puddles. Deliveries of goods, from fresh produce to coal, contributed to the mess, as sacks ripped, barrels leaked, and debris was left behind. The entire economic engine of the city generated its own inescapable byproduct. Filth. The concept of street cleaning was rudimentary. Scavengers or dustmen might collect refuse, but not with the regularity or efficiency of modern waste management. Often, it was a private enterprise, with individuals collecting valuable waste like rags or bones from dust heaps, leaving the truly valueless and unpleasant behind. The idea of a municipality ensuring widespread, regular street sweeping and waste collection was a slow-growing concept. You notice how people cope. Women lift their skirts, men tuck their trousers into boots or gaiters. Everyone walks with a certain wary stride, eyes scanning the ground ahead. It's a constant, low-level awareness of the environment, a perpetual defense mechanism against the pervasive dirt. You might see a shoeshine boy, his face smudged, offering his services, a clear indicator of the constant need to clean away the street's relentless deposit. This intimate, daily interaction with filth shaped the Victorian psyche. It fostered a certain resilience, perhaps even a hardened acceptance of unpleasantness. It also reinforced social divisions. The wealthy could afford to travel in closed carriages, shielding themselves from the worst of the street-level grime, while the poor were constantly immersed in it. The very ground you stood on was a tangible representation of the social hierarchy. So, as you lift your foot, trying to dislodge a particularly stubborn clump of mud, you realize that Victorian street life wasn't just about the bustling activity. It was about the constant, visceral reality of pervasive filth. It was a daily negotiation with biological and industrial waste, a testament to a time when cleanliness was a luxury and dirt was simply a fact of urban existence. You breathe a quiet sigh of relief, knowing that eventually you can return to streets where such pervasive grime is a distant memory. You're still very much present on those unforgiving Victorian streets. The memory of perpetual grime and horse manure fresh in your mind. But now, let's pivot from the general street-level filth to a specific, equally challenging environment, the workplace. The Industrial Revolution, while bringing immense progress, also created utterly unique and often terrifyingly unhygienic conditions for the vast majority of the working population. You find yourself standing near a towering, belching factory chimney, the air thick with the acrid smell of coal smoke and something vaguely metallic. The rhythmic clang of machinery is deafening, a constant pounding headache in the making. This isn't just a dirty street. This is a workplace designed for production, with human well-being often a distant second thought. The concept of occupational safety and health is decades, if not a century, away. Mainstream historical fact. Industrial factories and mines during the Victorian era were notoriously unhygienic, often lacking basic ventilation, sanitation facilities, and clean water. Workers were exposed to toxic fumes, dust, extreme temperatures, and dangerous machinery, leading to rampant occupational diseases and injuries. Think of textile mills filled with cotton dust causing bistinosis, or lead paint factories, causing painter's colic, a quirky tidbit in some textile mills. Children known as scavengers were employed to crawl under dangerously operating machinery to retrieve fallen cotton fibers, often risking severe injury or death by getting caught in the moving parts. Their small size made them ideal for navigating the cramped, lint-filled spaces, a horrific testament to the exploitation and disregard for safety in the pursuit of profit. It makes you shudder to think of such a perilous existence. Historians still argue whether the high rates of respiratory diseases in industrial towns were primarily due to the direct inhalation of industrial pollutants like coal dust or cotton fibers, or of the overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions of the workers, combined with poor nutrition, played a more significant role in their susceptibility to illness. Was the workplace the direct killer, or just an accomplice to the conditions outside its walls? As you cough in the smoky air, you suspect it was a deadly combination of both. Imagine working 12, 14, even 16 hours a day in these conditions. The air inside a textile mill would be thick with cotton dust, irritating lungs and leading to chronic respiratory illnesses. In coal mines, miners inhaled coal dust, causing black lung disease, a slow and agonizing decline. In chemical factories, workers were exposed to dangerous fumes without any protective gear, leading to burns, blindness, and systemic poisoning. You can almost feel the grit of the air settling in your lungs with every breath. Water for washing, if available at all, was often communal and cold. There were no designated changing rooms or showers. Workers would finish their shifts covered in grime, sweat, and whatever industrial residues their particular job entailed. This dirt would then be carried home, contaminating their living spaces and exposing their families to the same hazards. It was a continuous cycle of contamination. From the factory floor to the tenement room, sanitation facilities in factories were often rudimentary or non-existent. Overcrowded privies, if available, would quickly become foul and disease-ridden. Many workers simply relieved themselves wherever they could, further contributing to the unhygienic environment. The concept of workplace bathrooms with running water and proper drainage was a distant dream. The noise levels in many factories were deafening. The constant clatter and roar of machinery damaging hearing and adding to the mental stress. The extreme temperatures, especially in iron foundries or glassworks, meant workers toiled in sweltering heat, leading to dehydration and heat stroke. In contrast, working in damp mines or unheated workshops in winter brought the risk of hypothermia and rheumatism. The body was constantly under assault from multiple environmental factors. You see children, some as young as 5 or 6, working alongside adults. Their small hands were ideal for certain tasks, like piecing together broken threads in textile machines or crawling into narrow mine shafts. They were exposed to the same dangers and filth as adults, often for even longer hours and for meager pay. Their small bodies were even more vulnerable to the debilitating effects of the unhygienic and dangerous environments. It's a truly heartbreaking sight. The innocence of childhood sacrificed on the altar of industrial progress. The pace of work was relentless. Workers were expected to keep up with the machines, leading to exhaustion, accidents, and little time or energy for personal hygiene, even if the facilities existed. Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, and constant physical exertion weakened immune systems, making workers even more susceptible to the diseases lurking in their environment. Imagine working with lead, a common material in paint, plumbing, and printing. Workers would handle it with bare hands, and unknowingly ingest it from contaminated food or tobacco. Lead poisoning led to horrific symptoms: severe abdominal pain, painters, colic, paralysis, mental deterioration, and eventually, death. The concept of safe handling procedures or protective barriers was simply not in place. Even the food consumed at work contributed to the problem. Meals were often eaten on the factory floor, amidst the dust and grime, with unwashed hands. Lunch breaks were short and taken in the same contaminated environment. There were no clean break rooms or hand-washing stations. It's a miracle anyone remained healthy for long. The very design of the factories often hindered ventilation. Windows might be kept closed to maintain temperature or to prevent drafts, which were sometimes believed to cause illness. This trapped stale air, industrial fumes, and human effluvia, creating a suffocating and toxic atmosphere. The air you were forced to breathe inside was often even worse than the polluted air outside. The lack of personal protective PPE is glaringly obvious. No masks, no gloves, no safety glasses, no ear protection. Workers were completely exposed to the hazards of their jobs. Their clothes became saturated with grease, dust, and chemicals, acting as extensions of the factory environment rather than a barrier against it. You can practically smell the ingrained factory grime on the clothes of the workers, streaming out at the end of a shift. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a generation of workers plagued by chronic illness, premature aging, and early death. Life expectancy for industrial laborers was significantly lower than for the general population. It wasn't just about hard work. It was about working in conditions that actively eroded one's health day by day. You witness a worker, bent and coughing, far too young to look so old, and you feel the weight of countless unseen hardships. The reforms to address these conditions came slowly, spurred by public outcry, social reformers, and eventually government legislation. Factory acts gradually introduced regulations on working hours, child labor, and basic safety. But progress was incremental and often met with resistance from factory owners who prioritized profit over worker welfare. It was a long, hard fight for basic human dignity and safety. So, as you step away from the cacophony and grime of the Victorian factory, you carry with you a profound understanding of the human cost of industrial progress. The clean, safe, and often air-conditioned workplaces of today are a direct legacy of the desperate struggles faced by those who toiled in the unhygienic crucible of the Victorian industrial era. Your hands, surprisingly clean, suddenly feel like a badge of immense privilege. You've just escaped the stifling, grimy confines of the Victorian factory, and the memory of pervasive dust and the sheer human cost of industrial labor lingers. Now, let's pivot from the industrial grind to a realm where hygiene, or the lack thereof, had even more immediate and often fatal consequences. Medical practices. Prepare yourself, because Victorian medicine, despite its growing ambition, was a horrifyingly unsanitary affair by modern standards. You find yourself in what passes for a hospital ward, and your senses are immediately assaulted. The air is thick with the sweet, sickly smell of infection, unwashed bodies, and crude disinfectants. The beds are crammed close together, each holding a patient racked with illness or suffering from a recent procedure. You notice stains on the sheets, and the general dimness doesn't quite mask the pervasive dirt. This isn't a place of healing as we know it. It's often a breeding ground for further illness. Mainstream historical fact: before the widespread adoption of antiseptic and aseptic techniques in the late 19th century, surgical procedures were performed in highly unsanitary conditions. Surgeons often operated in their everyday clothes, without washing their hands or sterilizing instruments, leading to incredibly high rates of post-operative infection and death. The thought alone is enough to make you queasy. A quirky tidbit: amputations were common, often performed at terrifying speed by skilled surgeons to minimize the patient's agony, as anesthesia was either non-existent or crude. The surgeon might hold the saw in his teeth while preparing to operate, or simply wipe it on his blood-stained apron before the next cut. These gory details were often considered signs of a surgeon's efficiency, rather than a horrifying lapse in hygiene. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of a discarded limb. Historians still argue whether the resistance to adopting germ theory and antiseptic practices by some prominent medical figures was due to genuine scientific skepticism, professional inertia, or a reluctance to admit that their previous methods were actively harming patients. Was it intellectual stubbornness or simply human nature resisting radical change? As you watch a surgeon pick up an instrument that looks suspiciously unwashed, you lean towards a combination of all three. The concept of germ theory, pioneered by Louis Pasteur and refined by Robert Koch, was only gradually accepted throughout the Victorian era. For much of the century, doctors believed that disease was caused by miasmas, bad air, an imbalance of humors, or spontaneous generation. This meant that the idea of invisible microbes causing infection was revolutionary and often met with skepticism. Why sterilize something if you don't believe invisible bad things are causing the problem? You watch a surgeon about to operate. He's wearing his street clothes, perhaps a dusty frock coat. There's no scrub suit, no gloves, no mask. He hasn't washed his hands. His instruments, which might have been used on a previous patient just moments before, are simply wiped clean with a cloth, or perhaps rinsed in a basin of stagnant water. The operating theatre itself is often a public spectacle, with students and curious onlookers crowding around, further introducing contaminants into the air. Post-operative infection, known as hospital gangrene or pyemia, was rampant. Many patients who survived the initial surgery would succumb days later to overwhelming infection. The operating theatre was often less a place of healing and more a gateway to a slow, agonizing death. It was a lottery where your chances of survival were heavily stacked against you. Joseph Lister, a British surgeon, was a pioneer in antiseptic surgery. Inspired by Pasteur's work, he began using carbolic acid phenol to clean wounds, sterilize instruments, and even spray the air in the operating room. His innovations, though initially met with resistance, dramatically reduced post-operative mortality rates. Imagine the strong medicinal smell of carbolic acid in the air, a stark contrast to the stench of infection. This was a true game changer, but its adoption was agonizingly slow. Beyond surgery, general patient care was also lacking in basic hygiene. Wards were often poorly ventilated and overcrowded. Bed linens might not be changed frequently. Basic personal hygiene for patients, like regular washing or changing of clothes, was often neglected due to staff shortages, lack of facilities, or the patient's own weakness. It was a difficult environment for recovery. The use of shared medical equipment, such as syringes which were reused without proper sterilization, thermometers, or even bandages, facilitated the spread of disease from patient to patient. Bloodletting, using leeches or lancets, was still a common practice, believed to rebalance the body's humors, but these procedures were rarely sterile and could introduce new infections. You might see a patient with a dozen leeches clinging to their skin, a grotesque sight that simultaneously repulses and fascinates. Medical waste disposal was rudimentary. Contaminated bandages, bodily fluids, and even amputated limbs were often simply discarded with general refuse, contributing to the overall unsanitary conditions around hospitals. Imagine bags of biohazard waste casually tossed into the street with household trash. It's a shocking thought for your modern mind. The lack of understanding about cross-contamination meant that doctors and nurses could inadvertently act as vectors of disease, moving from an infected patient to a healthy one, without proper handling. Florence Nightingale, a towering figure in nursing reform, emphasized the importance of cleanliness, fresh air, and proper sanitation in hospitals, dramatically improving patient outcomes in the Crimean War through these simple, yet revolutionary methods. Her work highlighted that hygiene wasn't just a nicety, but a matter of life and death. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, caused by bacterial infection, was a leading cause of maternal mortality. Doctors delivering babies often came directly from performing autopsies or treating other infected patients, carrying pathogens on their unwashed hands. Ignaz Semmelweis, an earlier pioneer, famously reduced maternal deaths in his clinic by insisting on hand washing with chlorinated lime, but his findings were largely ignored or ridiculed during his lifetime. The sheer tragedy of preventable deaths hangs heavy in the air. The pharmacies and apothecaries, while offering remedies, also operated with varying degrees of cleanliness. Medicines were often compounded on site, and the ingredients themselves could be impure or contain harmful substances. Without strict regulatory oversight, the efficacy and safety of many treatments were questionable at best. You might see a pharmacist meticulously grinding herbs, but you'd also wonder about the cleanliness of the mortar and pestle lead. So, as you step back from the unsettling realities of Victorian medical practice, you feel a profound sense of gratitude for the sterile environments, clean instruments, and rigorous hygiene protocols of modern hospitals. For the Victorians, seeking medical help was often a desperate gamble, a journey into a realm where the very hands meant to heal could inadvertently inflict further harm. Your own good health now feels like an immense stroke of luck, a direct benefit of 2 centuries of hard-won hygienic progress. You've navigated the unsanitary streets, glimpsed the grim realities of industrial labor, and recoiled from the unhygienic practices of Victorian medicine. Now, let's turn our attention to something even more fundamental to daily survival: food safety. In an era without refrigeration, strict regulations, or scientific understanding of foodborne pathogens, putting food on the table was a remarkably risky business. You're wandering through a bustling Victorian market, and the sights, sounds, and especially the smells are overwhelming. Heaps of meat hang in the open air, swarming with flies. Fish lie on beds of melting ice, their eyes glazed. Over, vegetables, unwashed, are piled high, dusted with street grime. The air carries a medley of aromas, fresh bread, spices, but also a persistent undercurrent of decay, a hint that some of these goods are past their prime. This isn't your sterile, brightly lit supermarket. This is a wild west of food commerce, where buyer beware is the ultimate watchword. Mainstream historical fact: adulteration of food products was rampant in Victorian Britain, with common practices including adding chalk to milk, plaster of Paris to flour, or even copper salts to vegetables to enhance their color. These practices, driven by profit, posed significant health risks to consumers. It was a time when your daily bread might literally contain plaster. A quirky tidbit: street vendors would often sell pea soupers or hot eel pies, cheap and readily available fare. The ingredients, however, were often of dubious origin, and the dishes cooked in unsanitary conditions. The eels might have been caught from the highly polluted Thames, and the pies handled by unwashed hands. It was sustenance, yes, but often a gamble with your digestive system. You can almost taste the dubious delight, followed by the inevitable churning in your stomach. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of food adulteration was primarily due to a lack of regulatory oversight and scientific understanding, or if it was a direct consequence of poverty and the desperate need for cheap food, making consumers willing to overlook obvious signs of impurity. Was it ignorance or economic necessity driving the poisonous practices? As you eye a vendor selling suspiciously red meat, you suspect both played a role. The absence of refrigeration was arguably the biggest challenge to food safety. Meat and dairy products spoiled quickly, especially in the warmer months. But instead of discarding them, unscrupulous vendors would often try to mask the signs of decay. Meat might be heavily spiced to cover the smell, or dipped in colored dyes to make it look fresher. You might see butchers swatting flies away from carcasses that have been hanging for far too long, their surfaces glistening with an unhealthy sheen. Milk, a staple for many, was a particularly risky product. It was often diluted with water, sometimes contaminated water to increase volume, and then chalk or plaster of Paris might be added to give it a creamy, legitimate appearance. Without pasteurization, milk was also a common vector for diseases like tuberculosis and typhoid. Imagine giving your child a glass of milk, unknowingly feeding them a cocktail of chalk, water, and disease. It's a chilling thought. Bread, the staff of life, was also subject to adulteration. Flour might be bulked up with cheaper, non-nutritive, and sometimes harmful ingredients like alum, chalk, or even gypsum. This not only cheated the consumer, but also made the bread less nutritious. The very foundation of your diet could be compromised. Vegetables and fruits, while generally safer if eaten raw, were often handled by countless hands, exposed to street dust and animal waste in the markets. Washing them thoroughly was, as you know, difficult with limited access to clean water. Root vegetables, straight from the soil, would carry layers of dirt. You see a woman buying a bunch of carrots covered in mud, and you wonder how truly clean she can get them before serving. Fish and seafood, often caught from polluted rivers like the Thames, or transported long distances without ice, were prone to rapid spoilage. You might encounter the unmistakable smell of truly bad fish long before you see it. A pungent warning sign that most people were forced to ignore if they wanted. Cheap protein, the preparation and cooking of food in homes also posed significant risks. Kitchens were often small, poorly ventilated, and lacked running water. Food preparation surfaces might not be thoroughly cleaned. Hands, washed infrequently with dubious water, could easily transfer pathogens. Cross-contamination, the transfer of bacteria from raw meat to other foods, was a daily occurrence, unrecognized and unmitigated. Children were particularly vulnerable to foodborne illnesses, suffering from rampant diarrheal diseases that were often fatal. Their developing immune systems simply couldn't cope with the constant assault of contaminated food and water. You see a mother struggling to feed a listless child, and you understand the quiet desperation that surrounds every meal. The drive for cheap food, especially among the burgeoning working class, often outweighed concerns about quality or purity. A family struggling to put food on the table would prioritize quantity and affordability over potential health risks. If it filled stomachs, it was often deemed good enough. Despite the lurking dangers, the first significant legislative efforts to combat food adulteration came in the mid to late 19th century with acts like the Adulteration of Food, Drink, and Drugs Act of 1860. These acts empowered authorities to inspect food products and prosecute offenders, but enforcement was often difficult and inconsistent. It was a slow, uphill battle against entrenched practices and powerful commercial interests. You realize that the very food system was rigged against the consumer. Consider the role of street vendors. While providing convenient, hot food, these operations were rarely hygienic. Food would be cooked on open fires, exposed to street dust, and handled directly by vendors whose own hygiene might be questionable. The delicious smell of a hot pie might mask a multitude of sins beneath its crust. It was a culinary lottery where flavor might entice, but sickness often awaited. The lack of understanding about microbial spoilage meant that people relied on their senses, sight, smell, taste, to judge food quality. But as you've seen, these signs could be deliberately masked. And by the time food smelled truly putrid, it was already teeming with harmful bacteria. It was a losing game from the start. So, as you step away from the bustling, odorous Victorian market, you gain a profound appreciation for the invisible safeguards of modern food safety: refrigeration, pasteurization, strict health regulations, and transparent labeling. For the Victorians, every meal was a testament to survival, a daily gamble against contamination and deceptive practices. Your own secure, hygienically prepared meal suddenly feels like an immense privilege, a luxury born from a century of hard-won progress against invisible threats. You've just navigated the perilous landscape of Victorian food safety, a marketplace of hidden dangers and dubious delights. Now, let's narrow our focus to the most vulnerable members of Victorian society, its children. Their lives were often brutally short, and their hygiene challenges compounded by poverty, ignorance, and the pervasive unsanitary conditions that we've already explored. You find yourself in a narrow, crowded alley, and the air is filled not just with the usual grime, but with the distinct sounds of childhood. A child's cry, a sudden burst of laughter, the patter of bare feet on grimy cobblestones. But these sounds are often overlaid with the hacking coughs of the sick or the weary sighs of overworked mothers. Victorian childhood, for many, was a constant struggle against disease and neglect, where basic hygiene was often an unattainable dream. Mainstream historical fact: infant mortality rates in Victorian Britain were shockingly high, with estimates often ranging from 150 to 200 deaths per 1,000 live births in urban areas, largely due to preventable diseases like diarrheal illnesses, respiratory infections, and malnutrition, all exacerbated by poor sanitation. Compare that to modern rates, often under 5 per 1,000, and the scale of the tragedy becomes clear. A quirky tidbit: while middle and upper-class children wore elaborate, often restrictive clothing, working-class children frequently wore handmade that were ill-fitting, patched, and perpetually dirty. Many children, especially the very poor, might only have 1 or 2 outfits, which were rarely washed thoroughly. Imagine a child's entire wardrobe being a single, constantly soiled ensemble. It's a stark image of deprivation. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rate was primarily a direct result of poor hygiene and sanitation leading to waterborne diseases, or if factors like inadequate nutrition, maternal ignorance about childcare, and a lack of access to medical care played equally significant roles. Was it simply filth, or a constellation of disadvantages? As you watch a frail child try to play, you suspect it was a merciless combination. The challenges began at birth. Childbirth itself was fraught with danger, as you learned from our discussion on medical practices, for those infants who survived. Delivery, the first year of life, was a gauntlet of hygienic hazards. Breastfeeding rates declined in some urban areas, and the practice of feeding infants cow's milk, often diluted and contaminated, or even gruel, led to widespread diarrheal diseases. Imagine a baby bottle that was almost impossible to sterilize, filled with milk teeming with bacteria. It was a death trap. Children were often raised in incredibly cramped and unsanitary living conditions. Overcrowded tenements, with shared privies and limited access to clean water, were breeding grounds for disease. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread like wildfire through families, and children, with their developing immune systems, were often the first and most vulnerable victims. You can almost feel the stifling air of a small room packed with too many people, where illness could jump from one bed to another in an instant. Personal hygiene for children was rudimentary. Daily baths were out of the question for most, and even regular face and hand washing was a luxury. Children played in the filthy streets, their hands and clothes quickly becoming caked with mud, dust, and animal waste. They then brought this grime into their homes, contributing to the cycle of contamination. You see a small hand reaching for a piece of bread, and you instantly notice the layers of dirt under the fingernails. Head lice, as discussed, were almost a universal experience for children across all social classes. But for poor children, without access to even rudimentary treatments or regular hair washing, infestations could be severe and constant, leading to incessant itching and skin irritation. Dental hygiene for children was practically non-existent. Sweet treats were becoming more accessible, but toothbrushes and toothpaste were not. Early tooth decay and painful abscesses were common, often leading to early tooth loss. Imagine a child suffering constant, excruciating toothaches with no access to painkillers or dental care, enduring weeks or months of agony. Education about basic hygiene was scarce. Mothers, often illiterate and themselves products of an unhygienic environment, lacked knowledge about germ theory or proper sanitation practices. Superstitions and folk remedies often replaced sound medical advice. The cycle of poor hygiene was perpetuated from one generation to the next, not out of malice, but out of ignorance and necessity. Working-class children often began contributing to the family income at a very young age, working in factories, mines, or as street vendors. These workplaces, as we've explored, were incredibly unhygienic and dangerous, further exposing children to pollutants, pathogens, and physical injury. You see a small figure hunched over a workbench, their face smudged with soot, and you realize their childhood is being stolen by the relentless demands of survival. The pervasive cold and dampness in many homes contributed to respiratory illnesses, like bronchitis and pneumonia, which were particularly deadly for children. Without adequate heating or ventilation, and with poor clothing, children were constantly at risk from the elements. You shiver, imagining the biting cold of a London winter permeating flimsy walls, chilling small bodies to the bone. Even common childhood diseases like measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever, which are often minor inconveniences today thanks to vaccines and modern medicine, were often fatal in Victorian times. These diseases swept through communities, leaving a trail of devastation and grief. There was little to do but watch and pray. The lack of proper waste disposal in and around homes also directly impacted children. Overflowing privies, unemptied chamber pots, and general refuse attracted flies and rodents, increasing the risk of disease transmission. Children playing unsupervised in these environments were constantly exposed to pathogens. It was like a biological minefield for tiny adventurers. So, as you watch the Victorian children, their innocence often overshadowed by the harsh realities of their environment, you feel a deep ache of empathy. Their struggles for basic hygiene, their constant battle against unseen enemies, and their tragically short lives are a powerful testament to the transformative impact of modern public health and child welfare. Your own childhood, shielded by clean water, vaccines, and sterile environments, suddenly feels like an unimaginable privilege. Their silent suffering speaks volumes about a world where survival was a daily, hard-won victory. You've witnessed the perilous realities of Victorian childhood, a stark reminder of how vulnerable life was in an era grappling with hygiene. Now, let's delve deeper into the why of their struggle, specifically focusing on the dominant scientific understanding of disease for much of the Victorian era, the miasma theory. This belief system, while seemingly logical at the time, dictated many of their public health efforts and often missed the true culprits of contagion. You're standing near a particularly pungent alleyway where the familiar blend of decay and dampness hangs heavy. You might hear someone confidently declare that it's the bad air that makes people sick. This wasn't just a common saying. It was a widely accepted scientific explanation for how diseases like cholera and typhus spread. The miasma theory proposed that these illnesses originated from decomposing organic matter filth, sewage, stagnant water releasing noxious fumes, or miasmata, into the atmosphere, which were then inhaled, causing sickness. Mainstream historical fact. For most of the first half of the 19th century, the miasma theory was the prevailing medical explanation for the spread of epidemic diseases, predating the widespread acceptance of germ theory. Leading medical figures and public health reformers often attributed outbreaks to environmental factors like foul odors and stagnant air, rather than microscopic organisms. A quirky tidbit: to combat the perceived miasma, people would often burn strong-smelling substances like tar or sulfur in their homes, or even carry nosegays, small bouquets of flowers and herbs when walking through particularly foul-smelling areas. The belief was that pleasant smells could overpower or purify the bad air, offering a fragrant, if ultimately useless, defense against disease. You can almost smell the faint, acrid tang of burning tar mixed with lavender as you pass a doorway. Historians still argue whether the miasma theory, despite its scientific inaccuracy regarding the true cause of disease, paradoxically led to some beneficial public health reforms like improved drainage and street cleaning simply by focusing attention on reducing visible filth, even if for the wrong reasons. Did a flawed theory lead to accidental progress? As you watch laborers clearing a particularly foul drain, you realize that sometimes doing the right thing for the wrong reason still yields positive results. The appeal of the miasma theory was strong because it made intuitive sense in a world that so visibly and undeniably stank. If a neighborhood smelled putrid and people there were falling ill, it seemed perfectly logical to connect the two. The visible filth and the palpable stench were the obvious enemies. It was a sensory-driven explanation for an unseen problem. This belief system directly influenced public health initiatives. Efforts were focused on removing visible sources of decay and improving ventilation. Laws were passed to regulate the disposal of refuse, drain swamps, and improve street cleaning, all in an effort to purify the air. Grand engineering projects, like Boswell-Jet's sewer system, were primarily championed as ways to remove the stench of the Thames and make the city more pleasant, rather than as a direct attack on waterborne pathogens. The Great Stink was a wake-up call for the nose, not the microscope. You see, a sanitarian, perhaps a local health official, inspecting a building. He's likely looking for dampness, poor drainage, and accumulated rubbish. Convinced that these are the sources of disease, he might recommend opening windows more often or pouring lime into latrines, all based on the premise of reducing miasma. While these actions could sometimes indirectly improve health, for example, removing stagnant water might reduce mosquito breeding, they often missed the crucial link of disease transmission through contaminated water or direct contact. The idea of personal cleanliness was often tied into the miasma theory too. A clean person living in a clean house was believed to be less susceptible to miasmatic influences, while true cleanliness does reduce exposure to pathogens. The reasoning was rooted in good air rather than no germs. It put a moralistic spin on hygiene, where sickness could sometimes be attributed to a lack of effort in keeping one's surroundings pure. You might hear debates about the effectiveness of ventilation. Windows were often kept closed, ironically, to keep out the very smells and cold air that were thought to carry disease. The fear of night air or fog was also prevalent, leading people to seal up their homes, inadvertently trapping stale air and increasing the concentration of true airborne pathogens. It was a tragic catch-22, where attempts to avoid one perceived danger led directly into the path of a real one. The scientific breakthrough of germ theory, championed by figures like Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and the aforementioned Joseph Lister and John Snow, gradually began to dismantle the miasma theory. Their work, demonstrating that invisible microorganisms cause disease, was initially met with resistance. It challenged deeply held beliefs and required a mental leap into a microscopic world that couldn't be seen or smelled. Imagine trying to convince someone that a glass of clear, odorless water could be deadly, simply because of something tiny and invisible within it. The transition from miasma to germ theory was not sudden. For decades, the two theories coexisted, with some reformers advocating for both clean air and clean water, without fully understanding the precise mechanisms. It was a period of scientific ferment and intellectual struggle, where new ideas slowly gained traction against ingrained assumptions. The public health movement, driven by social reformers like Edwin Chadwick, initially focused on the sanitary idea, the belief that improving environmental sanitation would improve public health. While Chadwick was a strong proponent of the miasma theory, his relentless advocacy for better drainage, sewers, and waste removal ultimately led to significant health improvements, even if he didn't fully understand the scientific underpinnings of why they worked. His legacy is a fascinating example of effective action born from imperfect understanding. You might see pamphlets distributed, urging citizens to keep their streets clean, or warning against the dangers of stagnant water, all couched in the language of miasma. The urgency was palpable, the fear of unseen noxious vapors a constant motivator. It was a constant low-level dread, an invisible cloud of danger that everyone believed permeated their very atmosphere. So, as you reflect on the miasma theory, you appreciate the human attempt to make sense of a terrifying, unseen enemy. While scientifically incorrect, it spurred massive infrastructure projects and led to important, albeit unintended, public health improvements. Yet, it also held back progress, perpetuating a focus on smells over microbes. You realize that sometimes, even well-intentioned ignorance can have devastating consequences, and the clarity of scientific understanding, once achieved, is a truly liberating force. The air around you, though still dirty, now feels a little less menacing, armed with the knowledge of what really causes disease. You've just navigated the fascinating, albeit flawed, logic of the miasma theory, understanding how its focus on bad air drove some genuinely massive, if scientifically misdirected, public health efforts. Now, let's bring it back to the micro level, to the very heart of Victorian daily life, the domestic chores. You'll quickly discover that maintaining even a semblance of cleanliness in a Victorian home was a never-ending, back-breaking battle against the pervasive grime. You step inside a typical Victorian terraced house, perhaps a modest middle-class dwelling, and immediately you notice a layer of fine dust on every surface. The air, despite attempts at ventilation, feels stale and heavy, permeated with the scent of coal smoke, cooking, and the indefinable musk of an old house. This isn't just about tidying up. It's about a constant, physical struggle to keep the outside world from overwhelming the inside. Mainstream historical fact: without modern conveniences like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and indoor plumbing, domestic cleaning in Victorian homes was an incredibly labor-intensive process, largely performed manually and requiring significant time and effort, even for simple tasks. Imagine trying to clean an entire house with just brooms, dustpans, and buckets of water, a quirky tidbit to protect delicate carpets from the inevitable soot and mud tracked in from outside. Wealthy households would often employ bootboys, or housemaids whose sole task was to brush and clean shoes and boots repeatedly throughout the day. It's a testament to the sheer volume of grime that an entire job could be dedicated to just one small aspect of fighting dirt. You can almost hear the rhythmic thwack of a brush on leather. Historians still argue whether the obsessive focus on domestic cleanliness, particularly among middle and upper-class Victorian women, was primarily a genuine attempt to combat disease and maintain health, or if it was more a performance of social status and moral uprightness in an era where outward appearance was paramount. Was it about germs or about keeping up appearances? As you watch a maid vigorously polishing a brass doorknob, you suspect it was a complex blend of both motivations. Consider the floors, carpets, especially heavy wool ones, absorbed dust, soot, and whatever else was tracked in. Cleaning them involved beating them outdoors, a dusty, strenuous task usually done by servants or the man of the house, or dry brushing them, which mostly just stirred the dust into the air. Wooden floors required scrubbing with harsh soaps, and often a good deal of elbow grease. And remember, the water for this cleaning had to be fetched, heated, and carried. Dusting was a daily, losing battle. Coal fires, the primary source of heat in cooking, produced a constant stream of fine, black soot that settled on every surface. Windows, though providing light, also allowed street dust and soot to enter. Imagine wiping down surfaces every single day, only for a fresh layer of grime to appear hours later. It was a Sisyphean task, a never-ending cycle of wiping and re-wiping. Laundry, as you've previously considered, was a monumental chore. For most families, it was a weekly event, taking an entire day. It involved boiling clothes in large coppers, scrubbing them on washboards with harsh lye soap, rinsing them repeatedly, wringing them out by hand, and then hanging them to dry outdoors, where they were often exposed to more soot and airborne dirt. You can almost feel the aches in your back and arms just thinking about the sheer physical exertion. Kitchens, even in wealthier homes, were often primitive by modern standards. Without running water, sinks with drains, or modern dishwashers. Washing dishes was a laborious process, often done with cold or lukewarm water, and then left to air dry. Food, scraps, and waste attracted pests, making constant cleaning essential, yet difficult. The smell of cooking, mingled with lingering food odors, might perpetually cling to the air. Bedrooms presented their own challenges. Bed linens, while changed more frequently than outer clothing, still accumulated dust and skin particles. Mattresses were often stuffed with straw or horsehair, providing ideal breeding grounds for dust, mites, and other pests. Airing bedding outdoors was common practice, but again, this just exposed it to the ubiquitous outdoor grime. You can almost feel the slightly musty dampness of old bedding. Waste disposal within the home was also a significant issue. Chamber pots, used overnight, had to be emptied, usually into an outdoor privy or directly into the street in poorer areas. Ashes from fires had to be collected daily. Food waste, unless carefully managed, quickly putrefied, attracting flies. And vermin, without regular municipal waste collection, accumulating refuse was a constant problem for middle and upper class families. Domestic chores were largely the domain of servants. A large household might employ a small army of maids, cooks, and scullery maids, each dedicated to different aspects of maintaining cleanliness. But even with staff, the physical labor remained immense. The mistress of the house might oversee, but it was the servants who bore the brunt of the grime. It highlights the stark class divide in terms of who actually had to do the dirty work. The battle extended to personal effects, brushing clothes, polishing shoes, cleaning hats. These were daily routines for both men and women, ensuring an outward appearance of respectability. Imagine the constant effort to maintain a pristine image when every surface you touch and every breath you take is contributing to a layer of grime. The social pressure to maintain a clean and tidy home was immense, particularly for women, as it reflected directly on their competence and moral character. A dirty house was seen as a reflection of a dirty character. This fueled endless efforts, often for little visible reward in the face of overwhelming environmental challenges. It was a performance as much as a practical endeavor. You realize that the concept of a clean house in the Victorian era was vastly different from our modern standard. It was a constant war, fought with rudimentary tools against an invisible enemy, germs, and a very visible one: soot, mud, manure, industrial dust. The sheer physical exertion required for even basic household maintenance would exhaust a modern person. So, as you wipe a phantom film of soot from your fingers, you feel a profound appreciation for your washing machine, your vacuum cleaner, and the simple luxury of running water and effective cleaning products. The Victorian domestic sphere was a testament to human endurance, a quiet battleground where the fight against pervasive dirt was waged, day in and day out, with endless toil and often very little true victory. Your own home now feels like a sanctuary of effortless cleanliness. You've just witnessed the relentless, back-breaking domestic battle against Victorian grime, a testament to sheer human endurance. Now, let's talk about a different kind of battle. one waged against unseen, scuttling, and often disease-carrying invaders. Pest control. In a world awash with refuse and poor sanitation, rodents and insects weren't just nuisances. They were omnipresent, unsettling features of daily life. You're in a dimly lit Victorian cellar, or perhaps a cramped tenement room, and you hear the unmistakable scuttling sound in the walls. A shadowy shape darts across the floor. This isn't just an occasional mouse. This is a constant, endemic problem. Rats, mice, cockroaches, fleas, and bedbugs were pervasive inhabitants of Victorian homes and public spaces, flourishing in the conditions created by overcrowding and inadequate sanitation. Mainstream historical fact. Rat infestations were common in Victorian cities, particularly in areas with poor waste disposal. Rats carried diseases like plague, though less of a threat in the 19th century compared to earlier centuries, and leptospirosis and contaminated food supplies, posing a significant public health risk. They were an ever-present, unwelcome guest. Quirky tidbit: rat catchers were a recognized profession, often employing dogs like terriers to help them clear infestations. These individuals were essential, if somewhat grisly, figures in urban environments, battling the vermin that plagued homes and businesses. Imagine a person whose sole job is to wrangle diseased rodents, not for the faint of heart. You can almost hear the frantic yapping of a terrier in hot pursuit. Historians still argue whether the efforts to control vermin in Victorian cities were primarily driven by a desire for public health and disease prevention, or if the aesthetic and psychological discomfort caused by their presence, the disgust, the property damage, the fear of bites, was the stronger motivating factor for individuals and authorities. Was it about germs, or just about not wanting creepy crawlies in your bed? As you feel a phantom tickle on your ankle, you suspect it was a strong combination of both. Rats and mice thrived in the abundant food sources provided by uncollected garbage, open sewers, and poorly stored food. They nested in wall cavities, under floorboards, and in cellars, often moving freely between homes and businesses. Their droppings and urine contaminated surfaces and food, and their gnawing could damage property. The sound of their nocturnal movements would have been a common, unsettling backdrop to sleep for many. Cockroaches were another ubiquitous pest, flourishing in warm, damp environments like kitchens and sculleries. They scuttled across floors, counters, and dishes, leaving behind trails of filth and potentially spreading bacteria. Imagine trying to prepare a meal while constantly shooing away these resilient, repulsive insects. Fleas were an almost unavoidable reality, hitching rides on pets, clothing, and even people. They caused incessant itching and discomfort, and were also vectors for diseases. You've heard about the head lice, but fleas were a whole other level of pervasive skin irritation, causing sleepless nights and constant scratching. Bedbugs, tiny nocturnal blood feeders, were rampant in crowded tenements and lodging houses. They hid in mattress seams, cracks in walls, and bed frames, emerging at night to feed. Their bites caused itchy welts, leading to discomfort and secondary skin infections. From scratching, imagine the agony of trying to sleep while your bed literally teemed with biting insects. The methods of pest control were rudimentary. Traps, poison, often arsenic or strychnine, which posed their own dangers, and cats or dogs were common. For insects, boiling water might be poured into cracks, or fumigation using sulfur or other harsh chemicals might be attempted, but these were often temporary solutions. The sheer scale of the problem meant total eradication was impossible for most households. The lack of sealed buildings contributed to the problem. Gaps around doors and windows, cracks in walls, and unsealed pipe entries provided easy access for rodents and insects. Many homes were simply not built to be pest-proof, a challenge that modern construction takes for granted. The presence of these pests had significant psychological impacts. The constant awareness of rats in the walls, roaches in the kitchen, or fleas on your person would have been a source of perpetual anxiety and disgust. It eroded the sense of safety and sanctity of one's own home, making it feel constantly invaded. For the poor, sharing crowded beds meant that bedbugs and fleas spread rapidly. Personal items like clothing and bedding could easily become infested, and without effective means of cleaning them, the cycle continued. It was a constant losing battle against a teeming, unseen army. Public health efforts sometimes included attempts at large-scale pest control, particularly during outbreaks of diseases suspected to be carried by rodents. But these efforts were often localized and lacked the systematic approach of modern urban pest management. The problem was so widespread that it required a constant, concerted effort that was often beyond the resources or understanding of the time. Consider the general tolerance. Because pests were so common, a certain level of acceptance, or at least resignation, likely developed. While still reviled, their presence wasn't as shocking as it might be to someone from our clean future. It was simply a part of the backdrop of life in a Victorian city. Even shops and businesses struggled. Food stores battled rats and mice that could contaminate inventory. Pubs and restaurants faced constant infestations of roaches and flies. Maintaining hygiene in such establishments was an uphill battle, often leading to contaminated food and unsanitary conditions for patrons. The very fact that professions like rat catcher and exterminator existed and were in constant demand speaks volumes about the pervasive nature of the problem. It was a necessary evil, a dirty job, but one vital to maintaining even a semblance of control over the crawling, scuttling realities of Victorian urban life. So, as you hear another faint scuttling sound or feel a phantom itch, you realize that, for Victorians, simply existing meant sharing their living spaces with a host of unwelcome creatures. The quiet efficiency of modern pest control, the sealed packaging of food, and the very structure of our homes are silent heroes that protect us from a daily battle that the Victorians fought tirelessly and often in vain. Your peaceful, pest-free sleep now feels like an immense, hard-won luxury. You've just endured the persistent, skin-crawling reality of Victorian pest control, a testament to how fundamentally intertwined life was with unseen and often seen vermin. Now, let's pivot to the most solemn, yet equally revealing aspect of Victorian life, inextricably linked to hygiene, mortality, and mourning. In an era defined by high death rates, how people dealt with death, from the final moments to elaborate funerals, reflected their understanding of disease and cleanliness. You find yourself in a Victorian home where a death has recently occurred. The air is heavy, not just with grief, but with the cloying scent of lilies and perhaps disinfectant. A main historical fact immediately becomes apparent. Death was a far more common and public event in Victorian society than it is today, often occurring in the home due to the lack of hospitals and hospice care. The constant threat of infectious disease meant that death could strike suddenly and brutally, leaving families grappling with loss and the fear of contagion. Mainstream historical fact: due to high rates of infectious diseases, like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis, death was a common occurrence, particularly among children and the urban poor. Life expectancy was significantly lower than today, making elaborate mourning rituals and the direct, immediate handling of the deceased a central part of Victorian life. A quirky tidbit: due to the fear of being buried alive, particularly after instances where people revived in coffins, some Victorian coffins were designed with safety coffins features, including bells that could be rung from inside the coffin. While this practice wasn't widespread, it highlights the morbid anxieties of a time when the line between life and death seemed more permeable. You can almost hear the faint, chilling jingle of a bell, a last desperate plea from beneath the earth. Historians still argue whether the elaborate and prolonged mourning rituals of the Victorian era were primarily a genuine expression of grief and respect for the deceased, or if they served as a coping mechanism for the high rates of death, providing a structured way for society to process constant loss. Was it true sorrow or a societal defense mechanism against overwhelming tragedy? As you witnessed the somber faces and the careful draping of black crepe, you suspect it was a deeply entwined combination. When a death occurred, particularly from an infectious disease, the body itself became a source of concern. Without a clear understanding of germ transmission, families often kept the deceased at home for several days, for wakes and viewing before burial. This practice, while comforting for grieving families, could inadvertently contribute to the spread of disease, especially if the death was from something highly contagious like cholera. The very act of mourning could become a vector for further tragedy. The practice of laying out the body involved washing the deceased, dressing them in their best clothes, and often placing them on ice or in a cool room to slow decomposition. This was done without the modern understanding of disinfection. The water used, the cloths, the hands that touched the body, all could potentially carry pathogens. Undertakers, a growing profession, would come into direct contact with potentially contaminated bodies, often without adequate protection. Embalming, while practiced, was not as common or as sophisticated as it is today. Its primary purpose was often to preserve the body for a longer viewing period or for transport, not necessarily for disease control. Formaldehyde, a key component of modern embalming fluids, was not widely used until later in the century. The rituals of mourning were incredibly strict and elaborate, especially for women. Widows were expected to wear full mourning dress black from head to toe for at least a year, often two, followed by lighter mourning periods. This visual display of grief reinforced the constant presence of death in society. You see figures in deep black, moving silently through the bustling streets, a somber counterpoint to the vibrant chaos. Funerals were grand affairs, even for the working class, often involving horse-drawn hearses, long processions, and significant expense. This extravagance, despite the poverty many faced, underscored the importance of a good send-off and the need to show proper respect. Cemeteries, initially overcrowded churchyards in the city centre, eventually gave way to larger, purpose-built suburban cemeteries as the urban population grew and the need for more burial space became urgent. These new cemeteries were often designed as beautiful, park-like spaces, a grim green lung for the city. The very ground of the city held countless unmarked graves and overflowing churchyards. Before the advent of large municipal cemeteries, churchyards were filled to capacity, with bodies often buried on top of each other, contributing to groundwater contamination and the pervasive foul smells of urban centers. The smell of death quite literally, permeated the soil beneath people's feet. The psychological impact of such high mortality rates was profound. People lived with the constant awareness of death's proximity. Families were accustomed to losing children, siblings, and parents at relatively young ages. This pervasive grief, while normalized, undoubtedly took a heavy toll on mental health. It fostered a resilience, but also a deep fatalism. The language of death permeated popular culture, from poetry to art. Memento mori, reminders of mortality, were common, from photographs of the deceased to mourning jewelry made from human hair. These practices, unsettling to modern sensibilities, were a way for Victorians to keep their lost loved ones close and to acknowledge the ever-present shadow of death. For the public health reformers, the high death rates, particularly from preventable diseases, were a powerful impetus for change. The sheer number of fatalities and the economic and social disruption they caused gradually forced authorities to address the underlying sanitary issues. Death was a powerful, undeniable argument for reform. So, as you observe the somber procession of a Victorian funeral, you grasp the intimate, pervasive relationship Victorians had with death. It wasn't just an abstract concept, but a tangible, ever-present reality shaped by the era's fundamental lack of hygiene. Your own distance from death, shielded by modern medicine and sanitation, feels like a profound and precious gift, allowing you to live a life where the specter of constant loss is far removed from daily experience. You've just borne witness to the intimate, pervasive relationship Victorians had with death, a constant shadow cast by the era's severe hygiene challenges. But amidst this grim reality, something fundamental began to shift. The mounting evidence of disease, the unbearable stench of the cities, and the persistent efforts of dedicated individuals slowly but surely started to chip away at old beliefs, leading to profound changing attitudes towards hygiene and public health. Ushering in the dawn of modern principles, you stand on the cusp of this transformation, feeling the subtle tremor of change beneath the surface of the persistent grime. It's not a sudden revolution, but a gradual awakening, a dawning realization that the old ways of dealing with filth and disease were simply not sustainable. The overwhelming human cost of epidemics, the economic burden of widespread illness, and the sheer discomfort of urban life finally spurred significant action. Mainstream historical fact: the Public Health Act of 1875 was a landmark piece of legislation in Britain, consolidating previous acts and placing clear responsibilities on local authorities to manage sanitation, waste removal, and provide clean water. This act marked a significant shift towards a more centralized and proactive approach to public health. It was a legislative turning point, giving teeth to the reformers' calls. A quirky tidbit: before universal sewer systems, the campaign for public baths and washhouses gained momentum, offering the working classes affordable access to clean water and facilities for personal washing and laundry. These municipal efforts, often seen as philanthropic, played a crucial role in improving hygiene for those who lacked private facilities. Imagine the joy of a proper hot bath and clean laundry, even if it was a communal experience. You can almost smell the honest scent of clean soap and freshly laundered cotton emanating from these establishments. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for these significant public health reforms was the scientific breakthroughs of germ theory and sanitary engineering, or if it was more due to the overwhelming social and economic pressures created by rampant disease and the unbearable conditions in rapidly growing cities. Was it intellectual enlightenment or practical necessity that finally forced change? As you observe both scientists in their labs and reformers marching on Parliament, you suspect it was a powerful, symbiotic dance between the two. The work of pioneering figures began to gain traction. John Snow, with his meticulous mapping of the Broad Street cholera outbreak, provided undeniable empirical evidence linking cholera to contaminated water, directly challenging the miasma theory. While his work was initially met with skepticism, its clarity and effectiveness in stopping the epidemic eventually made it impossible to ignore. His quiet, determined scientific rigor was a slow-burning fuse to a sanitary revolution. Likewise, Joseph Lister's introduction of antiseptic surgical techniques, using carbolic acid to sterilize instruments and wounds, transformed surgical outcomes. The dramatic reduction in post-operative deaths provided irrefutable proof of the importance of cleanliness in medicine. Imagine the initial resistance from doctors who scoffed at washing their hands, only to be confronted with statistics showing that Lister's patients survived at dramatically higher rates. Florence Nightingale's advocacy for sanitation in nursing and hospital design further cemented the understanding that clean environments were critical for healing. Her work during the Crimean War showcased how basic hygiene improvements could save countless lives. She literally cleaned up the nursing profession, and in doing so, cleaned up hospitals to dot the concept of municipal responsibility for public health slowly emerged. Instead of sanitation being a purely private matter or a charitable endeavor, it became increasingly recognized as a public duty. Local authorities were gradually given powers to inspect housing, regulate overcrowding, ensure waste collection, and manage water supplies. This was a radical shift, acknowledging that individual well-being was inextricably linked to collective infrastructure. Public awareness campaigns, often driven by social reformers and philanthropists, also played a crucial role. They educated people about the importance of cleanliness, ventilation, and proper food preparation, even if the underlying scientific reasons weren't always fully understood. Pamphlets, lectures, and model dwellings aimed to disseminate better practices, slowly chipping away at ingrained habits. You might see a brightly colored poster urging people to boil their water. A simple but life-saving message. Technological advancements, while often spurred by the need for hygiene, also facilitated further improvements. Innovations in plumbing, water filtration, and waste treatment gradually became more sophisticated. The very infrastructure of cities began to catch up with the demands of their burgeoning populations. The steam engine, which powered factories and trains, also powered the massive pumps of Bazalgette's sewers. The changing attitudes weren't just about public health, but also personal hygiene. As scientific understanding permeated society, the link between cleanliness and good health became clearer. While daily bathing was still a luxury for many, the desirability of it grew. The focus shifted from merely masking odors to actually removing the sources of dirt and bacteria. Cleanliness began to be associated not just with morality or social status, but with scientific health. The latter part of the Victorian era saw a gradual decline in the rates of infectious diseases, a direct result of these cumulative improvements. Cholera, once a terrifying annual visitor, faded into memory. Typhoid became less common. Life expectancy, particularly in urban areas, began to rise, slowly but steadily. It was a tangible victory over centuries of disease. You witnessed the shift in small details. A cleaner street here, a better ventilated school there, a public tap dispensing clearer water. The grime doesn't vanish overnight, but the understanding, the determination, and the political will to fight it are growing stronger. The future of public health, though still imperfect, is beginning to take shape, built on the hard-won lessons of a century of filth and suffering. Severing. So, as you step through the evolving landscape of Victorian London, you feel the subtle but powerful currents of change. The dark cloud of ignorance about disease begins to lift, replaced by the glimmer of scientific understanding and the undeniable progress of systematic reform. You realize that the very foundation of modern health and well-being was forged in this era, a testament to humanity's capacity to learn, adapt, and ultimately clean up its act. You've witnessed the monumental shift in Victorian attitudes towards hygiene, a slow but undeniable turning of the tide against pervasive filth and disease. Now we arrive at our final reflection, the legacy of grime. Understanding how the struggles and innovations of the Victorian era profoundly shaped the clean, hygienic world we inhabit today. You stand in modern London, a stark contrast to the city we've explored. The air is breathable, the streets are largely clean, and the invisible threat of daily contagion is vastly reduced. Yet, the foundations of this cleanliness were laid in the very battles we've recounted, battles fought with imperfect knowledge but immense perseverance. Mainstream historical fact. Many of the fundamental public health infrastructures and principles we rely on today, such as widespread public sewer systems, regulated clean water supplies, food safety standards, and organized waste collection, have their direct origins in the reforms initiated during the Victorian era. These were not inherited but hard-won achievements. A quirky tidbit: even today, if you walk around London, you can sometimes spot distinctive cast iron stink pipes or ventilation shafts from Bazalgette's original sewer system, rising inconspicuously from the pavement. These seemingly mundane structures are living monuments to the Victorian battle against the Great Stink, and a reminder that their monumental efforts are still working silently beneath our feet. You might pass one without a second glance, unaware of its crucial, aromatic history. Historians still argue whether the comprehensive public health reforms of the Victorian era were primarily driven by altruistic social concern for the poor, or by pragmatic fears that disease would spread from the crowded slums to the wealthier districts, threatening the entire social fabric. Was it compassion or self-preservation that ultimately spurred change? As you consider the vast investment required, you suspect that fear, ultimately, was a powerful, if uncomfortable, motivator. The most obvious legacy is the physical infrastructure. Bazalgette's vast sewer network, the foundation of modern London's sanitation, is still largely in use today, a testament to Victorian engineering foresight. The very pipes that carry waste from millions of homes and businesses now are a direct descendant of that great Victorian undertaking. Clean water supplies, once a dangerous lottery, are now a given, secured by systems developed through lessons learned from cholera outbreaks. These hidden networks are the silent guardians of our health. Beyond the physical, the Victorian era forged the very concept of public health. The idea that a government or municipality has a responsibility to ensure the health and well-being of its citizens through organized sanitation, disease prevention, and environmental controls was born out of this period. Before, it was often seen as an individual problem. After, it became a societal imperative. We take for granted public health departments, but they are a direct inheritance from this era. The understanding of germ theory, once a radical and resisted idea, became foundational. Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Joseph Lister's work revolutionized medicine, leading to antiseptic surgery, vaccination, and the development of antibiotics. The shift from blaming bad air to understanding microscopic pathogens was the single most important intellectual leap in medical history, directly impacting how we prevent and treat disease today. Every time you use hand sanitizer or get a vaccine, you're benefiting from this Victorian intellectual revolution. Food safety standards, rudimentary at best in the 19th century, gradually improved thanks to the early public health acts and increased scientific understanding. While we still face challenges, the widespread adulteration and contamination of food that plagued Victorians is largely a thing of the past, thanks to the groundwork laid by reformers who fought for purer food and drink. You're safe. Packaged meal is a direct product of these hard-won battles. Even our personal hygiene habits, the daily shower, the regular hand washing, the brushing of teeth are cultural norms that evolved significantly from the Victorian period. While not universally adopted by the end of the era, the idea of frequent personal cleanliness gained scientific and social credence. The Victorians taught us, through their struggles, the tangible benefits of being clean. The social reformers of the era, from Edwin Chadwick campaigning for better sanitation to Florence Nightingale transforming nursing, laid the groundwork for modern social welfare and healthcare professions. Their advocacy, driven by a deep concern for human suffering, spurred legislative change and established professions dedicated to improving public well-being. The Victorian experience also taught us the immense cost of neglecting public health. The devastating epidemics, the shortened lifespans, the widespread suffering. These were powerful lessons that underscored the vital importance of investing in sanitation and hygiene. It was a brutal education, but one that ultimately saved millions of lives in subsequent generations. You can trace a direct line from the grimy, disease-ridden streets of 19th century London to the relatively clean and healthy cities of today. The noise, the smells, the dirt, the constant threat of disease. These were the crucible in which modern public health was forged. Their struggles are our silent victories. So, as you reflect on this long journey through Victorian hygiene, you realize that the comforts and safeties of your own life are not accidental. They are the deliberate, hard-won products of a previous era's painful learning curve. Every flush of a toilet, every sip of clean tap water, every sterile medical procedure, these are direct legacies of a time when the invisible battle against filth and disease was a daily, still often losing fight. Now, as the echoes of Victorian London fade and the quiet hum of your own home returns, remember this journey. Remember the smells, the struggle, the slow, hard-won triumphs. Let it be a gentle reminder of how far we've come and how precious the seemingly mundane aspects of modern cleanliness truly are.